The galaxy burned with the fires of conquest as the Emperor's Great Crusade swept across the stars. For nearly 2 centuries, the Space Marine legions had brought countless human worlds into compliance, reuniting the scattered children of Terra under the banner of the nascent Imperium. Among these transhuman warriors, few could match the martial prowess and organizational efficiency of the Ultramarines, the 13th Legion led by Primarch Robute Guilliman. Their methodical approach to warfare had earned them countless victories, with compliant worlds swiftly integrated into the growing realm of Ultramar. By the mid-31st millennium, the Great Crusade had reached its zenith. Hundreds of expeditionary fleets pushed the boundaries of Imperial territory ever outward, while the Emperor himself had withdrawn to Terra to work on his secret project within the Imperial Palace. Leadership of the Crusade had fallen to Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Luna Wolves, elevated to the position of War Master by the Emperor's decree. The relationship between the Ultramarines and the Word Bearers, the 17th Legion led by Primarch Lorgar Aurelian, had long been strained. While both legions had achieved numerous compliance actions, their methodologies could not have been more different. The Ultramarines brought worlds into the Imperial fold through tactical precision and administrative excellence, establishing functional governance systems before moving to their next target. The Word Bearers, in contrast, lingered on conquered worlds, building temples and converting populations to worship the Emperor as a god, a practice explicitly forbidden by Imperial truth. This fundamental philosophical divergence came to a head at Monarchia, the so-called perfect city on the world of Kur. The Emperor, displeased with the Word Bearers' slow pace and religious zeal, chose to make an example of Lorgar's favored creation. He dispatched the Ultramarines to raze Monarchia to the ground, forcing the Word Bearers to kneel in the ashes of their achievement, while the Emperor personally rebuked Lorgar for his failures. The humiliation at Monarchia altered the trajectory of the 17th Legion forever. Lorgar, his faith shattered, retreated into isolation with his most trusted advisors, First Chaplain Erebus and First Captain Cor Ferron. For nearly a standard decade, the Word Bearers appeared to reform, accelerating their compliance actions and seemingly embracing the secular Imperial truth. In reality, Lorgar had embarked on a pilgrimage into the depths of the Cadian Gate and beyond, seeking new gods worthy of his devotion. What the Imperium did not know, what even most Word Bearers themselves did not comprehend, was that Lorgar had found new masters in the warp. The primordial truth, as the Word Bearers came to call it, revealed the existence of the Chaos Gods, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh. These entities of immense power had seduced Lorgar with promises of knowledge and ascension. In the aftermath of his pilgrimage, Lorgar committed his legion to the worship of these dark powers, though this allegiance remained hidden from Imperial scrutiny. For nearly 50 years, the Word Bearers operated under a veil of deception. Outwardly, they prosecuted the Emperor's Great Crusade with newfound vigor. Inwardly, they spread corruption, identified potential allies, and prepared for the moment when they would reveal their true allegiance. First Chaplain Erebus proved particularly effective in this regard, his subtle manipulations extending to the War Master himself. Following Horus's near-death experience on the moon of Davin, Erebus had facilitated the War Master's corruption, turning the Emperor's favored son against his creator. By the time the triumph at Ulanor concluded, a massive celebration of Imperial might following the defeat of the largest Orc empire encountered during the Great Crusade. The seeds of heresy had been firmly planted. Horus, now corrupted by chaos, began positioning his pieces for what would become the greatest betrayal in human history. The War Master understood that not all Primarchs would join his cause willingly. Some, like Guilliman, remained steadfastly loyal to the Emperor and represented significant threats to his planned rebellion. The strategic genius of Horus manifested in his plan to neutralize these loyal elements. Rather than confronting the Ultramarines directly, he devised a scheme to remove them from the equation when the rebellion began. The Viridian system, located in the galactic south, had long been plagued by Orc activity. Horus ordered both the Ultramarines and Word Bearers to muster at Calth, a civilized world in the Viridian system, ostensibly to prepare for a joint campaign against the Greenskin threat. This directive served multiple purposes. First, it would draw the Ultramarines away from Terra, limiting their ability to respond when Horus made his move against the Emperor. Second, it positioned the Word Bearers to strike against one of the largest loyal legions, potentially crippling them before they could effectively oppose the rebellion. Third, it maintained the illusion of normalcy, with the War Master simply making sound strategic deployments as was his right. For Lorgar, the opportunity to exact revenge against the legion that had humiliated his own at Monarchia proved irresistible. The Word Bearers spent months preparing for what would become known as the Battle of Calth, gathering not only their military forces, but also cultists, demons, and other warp-touched entities that would aid in their assault. Lorgar assigned command of the Calth operation to his most devoted son, Corferon, while Erebus would provide support through ritual sorcery, arts forbidden by the Emperor but embraced by the corrupted Word Bearers. The scale of the betrayal being planned remained hidden from Imperial detection. Astropathic communications between the War Master and both legions maintained the pretense of a standard military operation. Horus even provided detailed intelligence on the supposed Orc threat, complete with falsified reports suggesting a massive greenskin buildup that would require the combined might of 2 full legions to counter effectively. As the 7th year of the 31st millennium approached, the Ultramarines began their mustering at Calth. The world itself represented everything the 13th Legion valued: ordered, productive, and efficiently governed. Its orbital shipyards and defense platforms had been expanded to accommodate the massive influx of military assets, while the planet's cities prepared for the arrival of hundreds of thousands of Astartes and their supporting human auxiliaries. Guilliman approached the joint operation with his characteristic thoroughness. The Primarch of the Ultramarines had developed detailed strategic projections for the campaign against the Orcs, allocating specific roles to both legions based on their demonstrated strengths. The Word Bearers would spearhead assaults against Orc religious sites, leveraging their experience in dismantling belief systems, while the Ultramarines would focus on systematic eradication of Orc infrastructure and military assets. The Ultramarines' mustering proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Legion vessels arrived in carefully scheduled intervals, taking position in Calth's orbit or docking with the massive orbital platforms for resupply and personnel transfer. On the surface, training grounds had been established for joint exercises, allowing the 2 legions to practice coordinated maneuvers before facing the enemy. Logistics officers worked tirelessly to ensure adequate supplies for what was projected to be a campaign lasting several years. Guilliman himself arrived aboard his flagship, the Macreg's Honor, approximately 1 week before the scheduled commencement of the campaign. The massive battle barge, pride of the Ultramarines fleet, took up position near Calth's primary orbital defense platform. From this command center, the Primarch reviewed final preparations and awaited the arrival of the Word Bearers' senior leadership. What Guilliman could not know was that the Word Bearers' fleet approaching Calth carried not allies but executioners. Their vessels had been modified with additional weapon systems concealed beneath false hull plates. Their holds contained not just Astartes, but also demon-possessed warriors and warp-touched abominations. Their astropaths and navigators had been sacrificed to dark rituals, their remains used to create focus points for the sorcery that would soon engulf the Viridian system. The Ultramarines' defensive posture at Calth reflected their trust in their brother Legion. While standard security protocols remained in place, there were no special precautions against treachery. Vessels from both legions shared orbital space, with Word Bearers' ships often positioning themselves in tactically advantageous positions without raising suspicion. On the surface, Ultramarines officers welcomed their counterparts from the 17th Legion, sharing intelligence and coordinating final preparations for the campaign. Theoretical and practical, the twin approaches that defined Ultramarine tactical doctrine had been thoroughly applied to the upcoming campaign against the Orcs. What no theoretical had considered, what no practical had prepared for, was the possibility that their brother Astartes would turn against them. The Ultramarines' greatest strength, their adherence to doctrine and procedure, would soon become a vulnerability when faced with an enemy that knew their methods intimately and had planned meticulously to exploit them. As the final elements of both legions arrived in the Viridian system, tension mounted among the Word Bearers who knew the truth. Soon the masks would fall away. Soon the 17th Legion would reveal their true allegiance. Soon the waters of Calth would run red with the blood of betrayal, and the galaxy would witness the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the Imperium forever. The stage was set. Nearly 250,000 Ultramarines had gathered at Calth, representing the bulk of Guilliman's legion. Against them stood approximately 50,000 Word Bearers, seemingly outnumbered but armed with the element of surprise and the corrupting power of the warp. The countdown to betrayal had begun, with Corferon and Erebus carefully orchestrating what would become one of the most infamous moments of the Horus Heresy. The Viridian system bustled with unprecedented military activity as the final elements of both legions converged on Calth. The planet itself, a jewel in the realm of Ultramar, featured a complex network of orbital infrastructure that had been significantly expanded in preparation for the joint muster. Massive void docks extended from the primary orbital plates, accommodating the constant flow of warships, while defense platforms bristled with weapon batteries and lance arrays positioned in strategic geosynchronous formations. At the heart of this orbital complex floated the Magna Macrag Civitas, a colossal space station that served as the administrative and command hub for the gathering forces. The station's central spire housed the primary strategic planning chambers, while its outer rings contained dock facilities for smaller vessels and shuttle bays for surface transport. The Civitas represented ultramarine efficiency at its finest, a self-contained command center with redundant systems, dedicated communication arrays, and heavily fortified strategic assets. Below, Calth itself presented a study in careful planetary development. Unlike many worlds in the Imperium, Calth's population lived primarily in underground habitats, as the planet's thin atmosphere and proximity to its sun made surface dwelling impractical for extended periods. These subterranean cities were connected by an extensive network of high-speed rail systems and transit tunnels, allowing for efficient movement of personnel and supplies. The surface featured numerous military installations and training grounds, temporarily established to accommodate the massive influx of Astartes forces. The Ultramarines contingent at Calth comprised approximately 250,000 legionaries, nearly the full strength of the 13th Legion. Leading them was Primarch Robute Guilliman himself, accompanied by his senior command staff. Marius Gage, First Master of the Ultramarines and Commander of the Elite First Chapter, served as Guilliman's right hand. Captain Remus Ventanis of the 4th Company had been tasked with coordinating ground operations, while Captain Ethan of the 19th Company oversaw void warfare planning. Captain Icos Lamiad commanded the Primarch's Honor Guard, the Invictus Suzerain, warriors whose ornate blue and gold armor marked them as among the most elite fighters in the Legion. The Ultramarines fleet presented an awe-inspiring display of Imperial naval might. The Macrag's Honor, Guilliman's massive flagship, dominated the orbital space near the Civitas. This colossal battle barge, nearly 26 kilometers in length, carried enough firepower to level continents. Supporting it were dozens of other capital ships, including the battle barges Antradamicus, Caesar, and Antipathy, along with strike cruisers such as the Aegis of Occluta, Faithless, and Samothrace. Hundreds of smaller escort vessels completed the armada, creating a defensive network that would have been impenetrable against any conventional enemy. The Word Bearers' forces, while numerically inferior at approximately 50,000 Astartes, still represented a formidable military presence. Their contingent was led by Corferon, the first captain of the 17th Legion and bearer of the title Black Cardinal. Though not a true Astartes, having been too old for full gene seed implantation when Lorgar was discovered, Corferon had been enhanced through other means, his body strengthened by both technological augmentation and warp-infused rituals. As Lorgar's adoptive father and spiritual mentor on Calchas, he maintained a position of unparalleled influence within the Legion. Serving alongside Corferon was First Chaplain Erebus, the architect of much of the heresy that had already begun to unfold across the galaxy. Erebus had been instrumental in the corruption of Horus on Davin, and his influence extended throughout the traitor legions. Unlike the bombastic Corferon, Erebus preferred subtle manipulation, using his charismatic presence and seemingly reasonable counsel to guide events toward the outcomes desired by his dark masters. The relationship between these two senior word bearers was complex. While united in their service to chaos and their loyalty to Lorgar, they maintained a rivalry that occasionally manifested as competing approaches to achieving their legion's goals. Corferon favored direct action and the raw application of power, while Erebus preferred manipulation and deception. This philosophical difference had led to some tension in the planning of the Calth operation, though both ultimately deferred to Lorgar's vision of revenge against the Ultramarines. The Word Bearers' fleet was centered around the Infidus Imperator, Corferon's flagship, and a massive battle barge that had been extensively modified with both conventional weaponry and warp-touched enhancements. Supporting vessels included the battle barges Camille and Destiny's Hand, along with numerous strike cruisers such as the Inferno Seeker, Crown of Calchas, and Liber Calchas. The 17th Legion ships bore distinctive crimson hulls adorned with scripture in gold lettering, passages from the Book of Lorgar that had once praised the Emperor, but now contained subtle references to the ruinous powers. Among the senior Word Bearers officers present at Calth were several who would play significant roles in the coming betrayal. Captain Zadkiel commanded the 7th Assault Company, warriors specialized in close-quarters combat and rapid strikes. Hal Baloth led the 18th Company, a formation that had been heavily involved in the Legion's secret rituals on Davin. Sor Talgron, captain of the 34th Company, maintained a reputation for tactical brilliance that had earned him respect even among the Ultramarines. The orbital shipyards of Calth represented a strategic asset of immense value to the Ultramar defense network. These facilities could service and repair capital ships that would otherwise need to return to major fleet bases for maintenance. Distributed across several orbital plates, the shipyards featured massive manufacturing complexes, assembly cradles for void ship components, and specialized repair docks equipped to handle everything from battle damage to routine maintenance. The destruction of these facilities would significantly impact the Ultramarines' ability to maintain their fleet operations throughout the region. Calth's defense platforms formed a comprehensive protective network around the planet. These installations varied in size and purpose, from smaller automated weapons platforms to massive fortresses housing thousands of human crew members and substantial Astartes detachments. The primary platforms, designated Calth Viridian Defense Platforms 1 through 17, were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, ensuring that any hostile approach would face concentrated opposition. Each platform contained void shields, lance batteries, torpedo tubes, and point defense systems, along with hangar bays for interceptor squadrons. The Magna Macrag Civitas served not only as a command center, but also as a symbol of Ultramar's administrative efficiency. The station contained extensive residential areas for both military personnel and civilian administrators, along with medici facilities, supply depots, and communication hubs. Its central command spire housed advanced auger arrays and tactical display systems that provided real-time information on fleet movements throughout the system. The Civitas also featured substantial defensive capabilities, including void shield generators, weapons batteries, and dedicated security forces. As the appointed time for the War Council approached, Guilliman and his senior officers prepared aboard the Civitas. The Primarch had developed detailed strategic projections for the campaign against the Orcs, with comprehensive tactical analyses and resource allocation plans. His approach reflected the Ultramarines' methodical nature. Each phase of the operation had been carefully plotted, with contingency plans for various scenarios and clear objectives for both legions. Corferon arrived at the Civitas with an entourage of Word Bearers officers, including Erebus and several company captains. The Black Cardinal's demeanor remained formal but distant, maintaining the facade of cooperation while inwardly savoring the approaching moment of betrayal. His enhanced physiology, a mixture of limited Astartes implants and warp-touched modifications, gave him a pallid, almost corpse-like appearance that contrasted sharply with the vital presence of the Primarch he was about to betray. The initial War Council convened in the Civitas' primary stratagium, a vast chamber dominated by a hololithic table displaying the Viridian system and surrounding sectors. Guilliman greeted the Word Bearers delegation with the formal courtesy typical of Legion interactions, though observers noted that the usual warmth between brother legions seemed absent. The history between the two forces, particularly the events at Monarchia, created an undercurrent of tension that even the Primarch's diplomatic skills could not entirely dispel. During the council, Guilliman presented his campaign strategy, outlining the intelligence on orc concentrations and proposed deployment patterns for both legions. The plan leveraged the Ultramarines' strength in coordinated operations, while acknowledging the Word Bearers' experience in dealing with enemy belief systems and leadership structures. Corferon and his officers offered measured feedback, suggesting minor adjustments that would, unknown to the Ultramarines, position Word Bearers' units advantageously for the coming betrayal. Erebus played a crucial role during these discussions, his calm, reasonable demeanor serving as a counterbalance to Corferon's more abrasive presence. The first chaplain asked insightful questions about specific tactical elements, creating the impression of genuine engagement with the campaign planning. His suggestions, seemingly helpful, subtly guided the Ultramarines toward deployment patterns that would leave them vulnerable when the attack came. Throughout the council, Ultramarines officers continued to arrive at the Civitas, reporting on the status of their companies and receiving briefings on their assigned roles in the upcoming campaign. The constant movement of personnel between ships and the station created opportunities for Word Bearers operatives to position themselves strategically throughout the orbital infrastructure. Cultists and corrupted human auxiliaries, brought to Calth disguised as support staff, moved into position near critical systems and security checkpoints. The War Council extended through several sessions, with technical discussions on supply lines, communication protocols, and coordination procedures between the two legions. Guilliman's attention to detail meant that every aspect of the campaign received thorough consideration, from major engagements to extraction protocols. The Word Bearers' representatives maintained their deception throughout, contributing to discussions while mentally noting vulnerabilities in the Ultramarines' preparations. As the formal planning sessions concluded, both legions continued their preparations based on the agreed strategy. Ultramarines vessels adjusted their positions to accommodate the planned departure sequence, while ground forces conducted final equipment checks and ammunition distribution. Word Bearers units ostensibly did the same, though their actual preparations involved very different objectives: the placement of ritual markers, the readying of demon-possessed warriors, and the positioning of assets for maximum damage when the betrayal began. The atmosphere throughout the Calth muster carried a sense of professional purpose rather than brotherhood. The historical tension between the legions manifested in limited social interaction between their officers outside formal settings. Ultramarines maintained their characteristic discipline and focus on the mission, while Word Bearers kept to themselves, conducting their private rituals and preparations behind closed doors. This separation, while noted by some observers, was attributed to cultural differences rather than recognized as a warning sign of impending treachery. The artificial dawn of Calth's orbital infrastructure bathed the void in cold lumens as the Word Bearers' fleet maintained their predetermined positions. Aboard the Infidus Imperator, Corferon stood on the command deck, his augmented physiology barely containing the anticipation coursing through his enhanced body. The moment of vengeance, long planned and meticulously orchestrated, had arrived. "Signal the fleet," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of Lorgar's authority. "Commence Operation Ingress." The Ultramarines remained unaware of the treachery about to unfold. Their vessels maintained standard defensive formations, shields at minimal power conservation levels, weapons systems in standby mode. Many of their senior officers were aboard the Magna Macrag Civitas, attending final coordination briefings or inspecting logistical preparations for the upcoming campaign. This dispersal of command personnel had been subtly encouraged by Erebus during the War Council, presenting it as an opportunity to ensure all officers understood their roles in the complex operation against the orcs. The first indication of betrayal came not as weapons fire, but as a digital assault. Throughout the Calth defense network, cogitator systems suddenly flooded with malicious scrap code, viral machine language that spread through data tethers and Vox channels with terrifying speed. This digital contagion had been crafted by the dark mechanicum allies of the Word Bearers, developed specifically to target the logical structures favored by ultramarine tech adepts. On the Magna Macrag Civitas, command screens flickered and died. Augur arrays reported phantom targets or failed entirely. Communication systems broadcast static or, worse, transmitted false orders that contradicted legitimate commands. The scrap code attack had been timed to coincide precisely with the Word Bearers' physical assault, creating a critical window of confusion during which the Ultramarines would be unable to coordinate an effective response. The viral assault was particularly devastating to Calth's orbital defense grid. The 17 major defense platforms, each a fortress in its own right, suddenly found their targeting systems compromised, weapons control locked, and void shields fluctuating unpredictably. Platform Viridian 9, positioned above Calth's northern hemisphere, suffered a catastrophic reactor overload when safety protocols were overridden by the scrap code, resulting in an explosion that destroyed the entire installation and killed all 4,000 crew members instantly. As digital chaos engulfed the Ultramarines' command and control systems, the Word Bearers launched their physical attack. The battle barge Camille, which had maneuvered into position near the orbital shipyards over the previous day, suddenly powered its engines to attack speed and rammed directly into Dock 12. The impact sheared through the dock's structural supports, sending thousands of tons of metal spinning into the void and killing hundreds of dock workers and Ultramarines in an instant. Simultaneously, Word Bearers' vessels throughout the orbital sphere opened fire on their Ultramarine counterparts. The strike cruiser Crown of Colchis targeted the Ultramarine vessel Antradamicus, catching it with shields at minimal power. Armor-piercing torpedoes struck the battle barge's command deck, killing Captain Lysimachus and his senior officers before they could organize a response. The sudden loss of leadership compounded the confusion caused by the scrap code attack, leaving the vessel's remaining crew struggling to mount an effective defense. The Word Bearers had positioned their ships with surgical precision during the mustering period, placing them near critical infrastructure and key Ultramarine vessels. This positioning now paid deadly dividends as they unleashed devastating close-range attacks against targets unable to respond effectively. The strike cruiser Inferno Seeker targeted the communication arrays on the outer ring of the Magna Macrag Civitas, severing the station's ability to coordinate with vessels in distant orbital positions and further isolating elements of the Ultramarine fleet. In high orbit, the monitoring stations that tracked solar activity from Calth's Sun Viridian faced a coordinated assault. These stations served both scientific and defensive purposes, providing early warning of solar flares that could affect void shields and communication systems. Word Bearers boarding parties, launched from strike craft that had been positioned for joint exercises, stormed these lightly defended installations. The boarders included not just standard Astartes, but also possessed warriors whose bodies had been given over to warp entities, granting them unnatural strength and resilience. Station Viridian Heliometric Alpha, the primary solar monitoring platform, fell within minutes. The small contingent of Ultramarines assigned to its protection fought with characteristic discipline, but were overwhelmed by the sheer savagery of the possessed attackers. The station's commander, Lieutenant Phrynon, managed to transmit a partial warning before a possessed word-bearer tore his head from his shoulders. The warning, fragmented by interference from the scrap code infection, reached only a handful of Ultramarine vessels and provided insufficient detail to clarify the nature of the attack. The systematic destruction of the monitoring stations served a purpose beyond simply eliminating defensive assets. Erebus had planned a ritual that would use Calth's sun as a conduit for warp energy, and removing these monitoring platforms prevented early detection of the solar anomalies that would soon manifest. Each station's capture included the placement of arcane symbols by specialized word-bearers units, creating a network of ritual markers that would amplify the sorcerous working Erebus had prepared. Aboard the Infidus Imperator, Erebus stood within a ritual chamber that had been hidden from Imperial inspection. The chamber's walls were inscribed with blasphemous symbols, and at its center stood an altar fashioned from the melted-down armor of Ultramarines killed during previous engagements. The first chaplain began an incantation in a language that predated human civilization, each syllable causing the air around him to shimmer with unnatural energies. In the void between Calth and its sun, reality began to thin. The ritual, combined with the synchronized destruction of the monitoring stations, created a cascading effect that allowed warp energies to bleed into real space. The first visible manifestation appeared as strange coronas around Viridian, colors that existed at the edge of human perception and caused nausea and disorientation in those who observed them directly. Back in the orbital sphere, the Word Bearers' attack expanded to target Calth's defense platforms systematically. Those platforms not disabled by the scrap code attack faced direct assault from Word Bearers' vessels. Defense Platform Viridian 3, which had maintained partial functionality despite the digital assault, managed to return fire against the approaching Word Bearers' strike cruiser Liber Calcus. The exchange was brief but brutal, with the platform's lance batteries scoring several hits before concentrated fire from multiple Word Bearers' vessels overwhelmed its void shields and reduced it to a drifting hulk. The Ultramarine response, though hampered by the scrap code and the surprise nature of the attack, began to coalesce as individual captains recognized the betrayal and took independent action. Captain Ventanus, aboard his strike cruiser Aegis of Occluda, quickly assessed the situation and ordered an emergency purge of all non-essential cogitator systems, limiting the spread of the scrap code within his vessel. This decisive action preserved the ship's combat capabilities and allowed Ventanus to organize a defensive perimeter around several damaged ultramarine vessels that had been caught in the initial assault. Captain Ethan, whose expertise in void warfare made him particularly valuable in the current crisis, found himself isolated aboard Defense Platform Viridian 12 when the attack began. Recognizing the platform's strategic importance for controlling the approach to Calth's northern hemisphere, Ethan took command of the confused human crew and implemented emergency protocols to restore partial weapons functionality. Under his direction, the platform managed to destroy 2 Word Bearers frigates that attempted to approach the Magna Macragge Civitas from the north. The casualties among the Ultramarines' fleet mounted with horrifying speed. The battle barge Caesar, caught between 3 Word Bearers cruisers, suffered catastrophic damage to its propulsion systems and weapons arrays. Captain Domitian ordered the vessel evacuated, but Word Bearers boarding parties intercepted many of the escape craft, resulting in the loss of over 3,000 Astartes and human crew members. The strike cruiser Faithless was destroyed outright when a salvo of torpedoes breached its plasma reactors, the resulting explosion consuming the vessel and 2 nearby escort ships. On the Magna Macragge Civitas, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Word Bearers infiltrators who had been positioned throughout the station revealed themselves, attacking critical systems and key personnel. The station's central command spire, where many Ultramarine officers had gathered for final briefings, was sealed off by sabotage to the access systems. Within this isolated command center, the officers found themselves cut off from their forces and unable to coordinate an effective response to the attack unfolding around them. The Macragge's Honor, Guilliman's flagship, was fortunately not in direct proximity to any major Word Bearers vessels when the attack began. The massive battle barge's command crew, led by First Master Marius Gage in the Primarch's absence, quickly recognized the betrayal and raised void shields to maximum power. The ship's machine spirit, more sophisticated than those of standard vessels, demonstrated unusual resistance to the scrap code infection, allowing its systems to remain largely functional despite the digital assault affecting the rest of the fleet. Gage ordered an immediate counterattack, targeting the nearest Word Bearers vessel, the strike cruiser Destiny's Hand. The Macragge's Honor's forward lance batteries opened fire, the energy beams cutting through the smaller vessel's void shields and carving deep furrows in its armored hull. The strike cruiser attempted evasive maneuvers but could not escape the flagship's superior targeting systems. A second volley struck its command deck directly, destroying the bridge and killing the command crew. The vessel continued on its trajectory, now a drifting hulk, until secondary explosions tore it apart from within. The Word Bearers had anticipated that the Macrag's honor would prove a formidable opponent even in a surprise attack. Corferon's strategy accounted for this, focusing on isolating the flagship rather than engaging it directly in the initial assault. Word Bearers vessels targeted the surrounding ultramarine ships and orbital infrastructure, creating a void zone around the Macrag's honor that limited its ability to provide support to other elements of the fleet. Throughout the orbital sphere, ultramarine vessels that had survived the initial attack began to organize into defensive formations. The lack of central coordination forced captains to rely on pre-established protocols and their own initiative. Small squadron-level responses emerged, with ships forming protective clusters around damaged allies or combining firepower to target particularly threatening Word Bearers vessels. These isolated pockets of resistance, while tactically sound, lacked the strategic coordination needed to mount an effective counter-offensive. The destruction of Calth's orbital defense platforms continued methodically. By 30 minutes into the assault, 12 of the 17 major platforms had been destroyed or rendered combat ineffective. The remaining platforms maintained limited defensive operations, but their effectiveness was severely compromised by the ongoing scrap code infection and the loss of coordination with other defensive elements. Platform Viridian 6, which housed a substantial ultramarine garrison, became a focal point of resistance, its remaining weapons systems targeting Word Bearers vessels that attempted to approach Calth's primary spaceport. As the battle in orbit intensified, the effects of Erebus's ritual began to manifest more dramatically. Viridian, Calth's sun, exhibited unprecedented activity, with solar flares extending millions of kilometers into space. These flares carried not just plasma and radiation, but also warp energy, creating distortion fields that affected both physical systems and the minds of those caught within them. Several ultramarine vessels that attempted to maneuver near these flares reported crew members experiencing hallucinations or falling into catatonic states after exposure to the anomalous radiation. The coordinated nature of the Word Bearers' attack revealed the extensive planning that had preceded this moment. Each element, from the scrap code assault to the positioning of vessels to the ritual focused on Calth's sun, had been carefully orchestrated to maximize the damage inflicted on the Ultramarines, while minimizing the risks to the 17th Legion. The betrayal at Calth was not merely an act of violence, but a meticulously crafted strategic operation designed to cripple one of the largest and most powerful Loyalist legions in a single, devastating blow. As the orbital battle raged above Calth, the tranquility of the planet's surface remained undisturbed for precious few moments. Garatin, the primary spaceport serving the northern continent, bustled with activity as supply convoys prepared for the upcoming campaign. The massive facility stretched across 30 square kilometers of Calth's radiation-scarred surface, featuring dozens of landing pads for spacecraft of varying sizes, extensive warehousing complexes, and processing centers for both military personnel and civilian workers. The spaceport served as the logistical heart of the Ultramarines' mustering operations. Ammunition, weaponry, vehicles, and other war materiel flowed through its cargo bays in staggering quantities, carefully cataloged and distributed by the Legion's logistics officers. Thousands of human auxiliaries worked alongside servitors and mechanicum adepts, managing the complex supply chains necessary to support an operation of this magnitude. Civilian administrators from Calth's governance structure coordinated with military personnel, ensuring that the influx of troops and equipment did not disrupt the planet's essential functions. Captain Remus Ventanis of the Ultramarines' 4th Company had established his temporary headquarters in Garatin's primary control tower. From this vantage point, the veteran officer could oversee the movement of supplies and troops while maintaining communication with orbital assets. Ventanis had earned his position through decades of exemplary service, his tactical acumen and steadfast leadership making him one of Guilliman's most trusted captains. The 4th Company under his command specialized in adaptive battlefield operations, often serving as a rapid response force capable of adjusting to changing combat conditions. The first indication that something had gone catastrophically wrong came when the control tower's communication systems suddenly emitted a burst of screeching static before falling silent. Moments later, the facility's power grid fluctuated, emergency lighting activating as primary systems failed. Ventanus, his transhuman mind instantly processing these warning signs, ordered an immediate combat alert for all Ultramarines forces in the spaceport. His order came seconds before the first Word Bearers drop pods punched through Calth's atmosphere. These assault craft, painted the deep crimson of the 17th Legion and adorned with blasphemous symbols that hurt the eyes of those who gazed upon them, targeted key strategic points throughout the spaceport. The primary command center, defense batteries, communication hubs, and power generation facilities all faced simultaneous assault, a decapitation strike designed to paralyze the Ultramarines' response capabilities. The Word Bearers' 7th Assault Company, led by Captain Zadkiel, spearheaded the attack on Garraton's central administrative complex. These warriors had been specially selected for this mission, many of them veterans of the compliance actions on Davin, where they had first been exposed to the corrupting influence of the warp. Their armor, while still bearing the crimson of their legion, displayed subtle modifications, scriptures etched in languages never meant for human tongues, small fetishes of bone and metal hanging from shoulder pauldrons, and eye lenses that glowed with an unnatural light. The civilian workers in the administrative complex had no chance against these transhuman killers. Administrative staff, maintenance workers, and logistics personnel were cut down with brutal efficiency. The Word Bearers showed no mercy, executing even those who surrendered or begged for their lives. Blood flowed across polished floor tiles as bolt rounds tore through unarmored bodies, the screams of the dying creating a cacophony that echoed through the complex's vaulted chambers. Captain Ventanus, hearing reports of the attack from scattered Vox transmissions, immediately recognized the existential threat facing not just the spaceport, but all Ultramarine forces on Calth. With orbital communications compromised by the scrap code attack, he could not contact the fleet or other ground forces to coordinate a response. Instead, he relied on his training and the discipline of his warriors, implementing contingency protocols designed for situations where command and control had been disrupted. Ventanus ordered his 4th Company to secure key defensive positions throughout the spaceport while dispatching runners to alert other Ultramarine units in the vicinity. The captain understood that controlling Garraton's anti-aircraft batteries would be crucial in limiting the Word Bearers' ability to land additional forces. He personally led a squad of veterans toward the spaceport's western defense complex, fighting through groups of Word Bearers who had already established blocking positions along major thoroughfares. The battle for Garraton's defense batteries became a desperate race against time. Word Bearers' forces, having achieved surprise, had already captured the eastern and northern battery complexes. Ventanus and his warriors reached the western complex just as a Word Bearers' assault squad was breaching its armored doors. The ensuing firefight demonstrated the skill and discipline that had made the Ultramarines legendary. Despite being outnumbered, Ventanus's veterans maintained fire discipline and used the complex's architecture to channel the attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. The captain himself engaged the Word Bearers' sergeant leading the assault, their combat a blur of ceramite and steel as power weapons clashed. Ventanus's pattern recognition abilities, honed through centuries of warfare, allowed him to identify weaknesses in his opponent's technique, a slight overextension on diagonal strikes, a tendency to favor the right side when pressed. Exploiting these patterns, Ventanus feinted left before driving his gladius through a gap in the Word Bearer's gorget, severing the traitor's spine and ending the duel decisively. With the western battery complex secured, Ventanus established a defensive perimeter and began coordinating with other Ultramarine elements that had survived the initial assault. The situation throughout the spaceport remained chaotic, with Word Bearers' forces controlling approximately 60% of the facility and continuing to receive reinforcements from orbit. The civilian death toll mounted horrifically as the traitors systematically executed workers in captured areas, creating grotesque displays that went beyond mere killing and entered the realm of ritual sacrifice. the strategic importance of Garatan extended beyond its function as a supply hub. The spaceport's communication arrays, when operational, could coordinate with similar facilities across Calth, creating a planetary defense network capable of responding to threats in a unified manner. By targeting these communication systems in their initial strike, the Word Bearers effectively isolated each defensive zone, preventing the Ultramarines from mounting a coordinated counter-offensive. Among the Word Bearers' forces assaulting Garatan were specialized units that had been transformed through forbidden rituals into something beyond standard Astartes. The Gal Vorbak, or Blessed Sons in the Colchian tongue, had undergone a process of demonic possession that allowed warp entities to share their physical forms. These warriors could maintain a normal appearance when necessary, but in combat, they underwent a horrific transformation, their armor splitting open to reveal mutated flesh and additional limbs, their faces distorting into bestial masks that reflected the nature of the entities dwelling within them. The first deployment of Gal Vorbak at Garatan targeted the spaceport's primary medical facility. This complex, staffed by hundreds of Medici personnel and equipped to handle thousands of casualties, represented one of the most significant humanitarian assets in the region. The Blessed Sons struck without warning, their partially transformed bodies moving with unnatural speed through the facility's corridors. Medical staff and patients alike fell before their assault, their bodies not just killed, but desecrated in ways that served the dark purposes of the entities possessing the Word Bearers. Apothecary Fornix of the Ultramarines' 4th Company led the defense of the medical facility's eastern wing, organizing a desperate last stand to protect wounded Astartes and civilian patients. The apothecary, whose primary duty involved preserving the gene seed of fallen battle brothers, found himself fighting a defensive action against enemies whose nature defied his scientific understanding. The Gal Vorbak shrugged off wounds that would have incapacitated normal Astartes, their flesh knitting together even as bolter rounds tore through their bodies. Fornix's stand, while ultimately doomed, delayed the Gal Vorbak long enough for several evacuation transports to depart from the facility's emergency landing pads. These vehicles, overloaded with wounded personnel and essential medical supplies, managed to escape the spaceport perimeter and reach Ultramarine positions in the nearby subterranean city of Calca's Fortalice. The apothecary and his remaining warriors died to the last man, their sacrifice allowing hundreds of civilians to escape the slaughter unfolding at Garatan. The Word Bearers' assault on the spaceport included not just conventional military tactics, but also sorcerous elements that had been carefully prepared in advance. Throughout the facility, cultists who had infiltrated the civilian workforce revealed themselves, activating ritual markers placed in key locations during the mustering period. These markers, inscribed with symbols that resonated with the larger ritual being conducted by Erebus in orbit, created localized warp disturbances that manifested as reality fluctuations, gravity anomalies, and in some cases, the direct manifestation of lesser warp entities. In the spaceport's primary cargo handling area, a massive storage facility measuring several square kilometers, one such ritual culminated in a catastrophic reality breach. The space between dimensions thinned, allowing entities from the warp to pour into real space. These creatures, driven by hungers incomprehensible to human minds, rampaged through the facility, attacking any living beings they encountered regardless of allegiance. Word Bearers' warriors, prepared for this eventuality, used hexagrammic wards and blood sacrifices to direct these entities toward ultramarine positions, turning the demonic incursion into another weapon in their assault. Captain Ventanus, receiving reports of the warp breach, recognized that conventional tactics would be insufficient against such threats. Drawing on the limited information available in ultramarine tactical databases regarding warp entities, he organized specialized strike teams equipped with plasma weapons and melta-bombs. These teams targeted the ritual markers themselves, destroying the physical anchors that maintained the reality breaches. Each marker eliminated caused a localized implosion that banished nearby warp entities, gradually reducing the demonic presence in the spaceport. The civilian casualties at Garatan reached apocalyptic proportions within hours of the initial assault. Of the approximately 130,000 civilian workers present when the attack began, over 70% were killed in the first 3 hours. Many died in the initial bombardment and assault, while others fell victim to the systematic execution sweeps conducted by Word Bearers' forces in captured areas. Thousands more perished in the panic that ensued, trampled in desperate attempts to reach evacuation points or trapped in structures damaged by the fighting. The Word Bearers showed particular cruelty toward civilian administrators and their families. Many had been housed in a residential complex adjacent to the spaceport's main administrative center. When Word Bearers' forces captured this facility, they separated the occupants by age and gender, subjecting them to different forms of torture and execution. Adults were often killed in ritualistic fashion, their deaths prolonged to maximize suffering, while children were forced to watch before being sacrificed in ceremonies dedicated to the ruinous powers. These atrocities went beyond military necessity or even conventional brutality, revealing the depth of corruption that had taken root in the 17th Legion. As the battle for Garatin continued into its 5th hour, Ultramarine resistance began to coalesce around several strongpoints. Captain Ventanis, having secured the Western Defense Battery Complex, established it as a command center for surviving Ultramarine forces. Using short-range Vox communication and runner teams, he coordinated with other officers who had established similar defensive positions throughout the spaceport. This decentralized command structure, while not ideal, allowed the Ultramarines to maintain some level of tactical coherence despite the communication blackout. The Word Bearers' initial advantage of surprise had been partially mitigated by the Ultramarines' disciplined response, but the traitors still held the upper hand. Fresh reinforcements continued to arrive from orbit, including specialized units like the Ashen Circle, warrior sensors armed with flamers and ritual axes, who specialized in destroying cultural and religious artifacts. At Garatin, these warriors targeted the spaceport's administrative archives, burning historical records and technical databases in a systematic attempt to erase the facility's operational history. The battle for Garatin represented just the opening phase of what would become known as the Calth atrocity, a planet-wide conflict that would test the Ultramarines' legion to its limits and forever change the face of Ultramar. As darkness fell on the first day of fighting, the spaceport burned, its structures illuminating the night sky with a glow visible from orbit. The Word Bearers had achieved their initial objectives, inflicting massive casualties and disrupting the Ultramarines' command and control capabilities. Yet Captain Ventanis and his warriors continued to resist, their determination unbroken despite the horrors they had witnessed. The command deck of the Magna Macragge Civitas shuddered as another explosion tore through the station's outer habitation ring. Robute Guilliman steadied himself against a tactical display table, his transhuman senses processing the cascade of information flooding into the command center. Warning runes flashed across auger displays, while emergency klaxons wailed through the station's internal Vox network. The Primarch's mind, engineered for strategic analysis, had already moved beyond the initial shock of betrayal to the cold calculus of survival. Guilliman had been in the midst of reviewing final deployment orders when the Word Bearers revealed their treachery. The first indication came when the station's primary cogitator systems failed, followed by the sudden loss of external communications. Seconds later, the station's void shields activated automatically as Word Bearers' vessels opened fire. The Primarch's reaction had been immediate and decisive, ordering the station's remaining functional systems diverted to defensive operations, while dispatching his Invictus Suzerain Honor Guard to secure critical junctions throughout the station. The situation aboard the Civitas deteriorated rapidly as Word Bearers' boarding parties breached the outer docking rings. These were not standard assault teams, but specialized infiltration units that had positioned themselves throughout the station during the mustering period. Their knowledge of the station's layout suggested extensive pre-planning, with attack patterns designed to sever command and control functions while isolating the Primarch from his legion. Captain Ikos Lamiad, commander of the Invictus Suzerain, coordinated the defense of the command deck's approach corridors. The Honor Guard, resplendent in their blue and gold armor, adorned with the icons of Ultramar, formed an impenetrable barrier against the advancing Word Bearers. Their discipline never wavered, even as the traitors employed weapons and tactics that violated every code of warfare the Ultramarines held sacred. Primary access to level Epsilon 9 has been compromised, reported an Ultramarine communications officer, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. Word Bearers' forces have deployed some form of warp-based weapon. Defenders report manifestations in the affected areas. Guilliman absorbed this information without visible reaction, though internally his analytical mind added this new variable to his rapidly evolving strategic assessment. The use of warp-based weapons indicated a level of corruption beyond mere treachery. The Word Bearers had not simply turned against their oaths, they had embraced powers forbidden by Imperial decree. The Primarch's immediate concern was re-establishing command and control over his scattered legion. With the station's primary communications array destroyed and the backup systems compromised by scrap code, conventional coordination methods were inoperable. Guilliman turned to more primitive but reliable alternatives, dispatching runners through the station's service tunnels to reach the auxiliary communication hubs in the outer rings. These messengers carried data slates containing encrypted command protocols and authentication codes that would allow Ultramarine captains to coordinate their responses despite the communication blackout. While the battle for the station raged, Guilliman maintained a clear view of the strategic situation through status reports delivered by these runners. The Word Bearers' attack had been meticulously planned, targeting communication hubs, command centers, and key defensive installations throughout the Calth system. The scrap code infection had spread through nearly all networked systems, rendering much of the sophisticated command infrastructure useless. Ultramarine vessels caught in the initial assault had suffered heavy casualties, with several capital ships destroyed outright and others severely damaged. Despite these losses, the Ultramarines' response was beginning to coalesce. First Master Marius Gage had established a defensive perimeter around the Macrag's honor, using the flagship's formidable firepower to create a zone of relative safety for damaged Ultramarine vessels. Captain Ethan had secured 3 of the remaining defense platforms, creating interlocking fields of fire that prevented Word Bearers' ships from approaching certain sectors. On the surface, Captain Ventanis had established defensive strongpoints around Garatan Spaceport, stemming the tide of the ground assault. These isolated pockets of resistance, while tactically sound, lacked strategic coordination. Guilliman recognized that without central direction, his legion would be defeated in detail, unable to concentrate their forces effectively against the Word Bearers' coordinated assault. The Primarch needed to escape the Civitas and reach his flagship, from which he could re-establish legion-wide command. The path to the station's emergency evacuation bays was blocked by Word Bearers' forces that had specifically targeted these escape routes. Guilliman, analyzing the station's structural layout, identified an alternative approach through the maintenance access ways connecting the command deck to the engineering sections. These narrow corridors, designed for servitor access to critical systems, would be defensible by a small force while allowing the Primarch and key command staff to reach the lower docking bays where several Thunderhawk gunships remained operational. Captain Lamiad organized the evacuation team, selecting his most experienced warriors to form the vanguard while leaving the remainder to hold the command deck as long as possible. The Honor Guard understood the nature of this assignment. Those staying behind were unlikely to survive, but their sacrifice would ensure the Primarch's escape and potentially the survival of the Legion. As the evacuation team prepared to depart, Guilliman downloaded critical strategic data to a secure data slate. This information included Legion deployment patterns, supply caches, and contingency protocols developed for scenarios involving catastrophic command failure. The Primarch had created these contingencies as theoretical exercises, never truly expecting to implement them. Now, they represented the framework upon which the Ultramarines' survival would depend. The journey through the maintenance corridors proved more challenging than anticipated. Word Bearers infiltrators had accessed the station's environmental controls, venting atmosphere from several sections and overloading power conduits to create zones of electrified gas. The Primarch's party was forced to don void-sealed helmets and proceed through areas where the metal deck plates glowed red with heat from damaged power systems. Despite these obstacles, Guilliman's perfect recall of the station's schematics allowed the group to make steady progress toward the lower docking bays. The Primarch moved with purpose, his massive frame navigating the narrow corridors with surprising agility, the hand of Dominion Power Fist humming with barely contained energy as he prepared for inevitable contact with enemy forces. That contact came as the evacuation team approached Junction Hub Theta 23, a nexus point where multiple maintenance corridors converged before opening into the secondary engineering deck. Word Bearers' ambushers had established a blocking position, their armor adorned with blasphemous symbols that pulsed with unnatural light. At their center stood a figure whose presence radiated malevolence, a Word Bearer's captain whose armor had been modified with Baroque enhancements that merged ceramite with what appeared to be ossified human remains. The ensuing combat was brief but intense. The Invictus Suzerain, moving with the precision that came from centuries of training together, engaged the Word Bearers in the confined space of the junction hub. Bolter fire echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space, the muzzle flashes illuminating walls scorched by earlier battles. Guilliman himself engaged the enemy captain, the hand of Dominion smashing through the traitor's corrupted armor with contemptuous ease. The Primarch fought with cold efficiency, each movement precisely calculated to eliminate threats while conserving energy for the challenges that lay ahead. With the ambush neutralized, the evacuation team proceeded to the secondary engineering deck. This vast chamber, dominated by plasma conduits and coolant systems that served the station's power generation facilities, showed signs of heavy fighting. The bodies of station crew and Ultramarines lay scattered among fallen Word Bearers, evidence of a desperate defense that had ultimately failed. Emergency lighting cast everything in a bloody crimson glow, creating an appropriately hellish atmosphere for what had become a battle for survival. The lower docking bays lay just beyond the engineering deck, accessible through armored bulkhead doors designed to contain catastrophic system failures. These doors, partially damaged in the fighting, required manual override to open, a procedure that would take precious minutes during which the evacuation team would be vulnerable to attack. Guilliman assigned a security detail to establish a defensive perimeter, while tech adepts worked to bypass the damaged door mechanisms. As the tech adepts labored, the Primarch received a priority communication from Captain Ethan, relayed through a secure Vox frequency that had remained operational despite the scrap code attack. The message was brief but alarming. Calth's sun was exhibiting unprecedented activity, with radiation levels spiking to lethal levels across much of the system. The monitoring stations that would normally provide early warning of such phenomena had been systematically destroyed in the opening phase of the Word Bearers' attack. Guilliman immediately recognized the strategic implications of this development. If solar radiation reached critical levels, void shields across the system would be strained beyond capacity, leaving vessels vulnerable to both the radiation itself and enemy fire. Ground forces without adequate shelter would face rapid radiation poisoning. The timing suggested this was not a natural phenomenon, but another aspect of the Word Bearers' carefully orchestrated assault. Before the Primarch could fully process this new information, the bulkhead doors finally opened, revealing the lower docking bay beyond. 3 Thunderhawk gunships remained on their launch cradles, apparently undamaged despite the destruction that had engulfed much of the station. The bay itself showed signs of fighting, impact craters from bolter fire scarred the walls, and the bodies of maintenance crew lay where they had fallen defending the facility. The evacuation team moved swiftly to secure the gunships, performing abbreviated pre-flight checks while maintaining defensive positions against potential counterattack. Guilliman, scanning the docking bay with tactical precision, noted signs of sabotage attempts on the gunships, cut fuel lines that had been hastily repaired, access panels to critical systems that had been forced open. The Word Bearers had attempted to eliminate this escape route, but had been interrupted before completing their work. As the Thunderhawks prepared for departure, Word Bearers' forces launched a final desperate assault on the docking bay. They emerged from multiple access points simultaneously, suggesting coordination via some means unaffected by the communication blackout. Among the attackers were several warriors whose physical forms appeared distorted, their armor split along unnatural seams to reveal flesh that pulsed with warp energy. These aberrations moved with unnatural speed, crossing the docking bay in bounds that defied normal physics. The Invictus Suzerain formed a protective cordon around the Primarch as he boarded the lead Thunderhawk. The Honor Guard fought with the desperation of warriors who understood their primary mission, ensuring their lord's survival, took precedence over their own lives. Several fell to the corrupted Word Bearers, their deaths bought with disciplined volleys of bolter fire that slowed but could not stop the warp-enhanced attackers. Captain Lamiad was the last to board, backing into the Thunderhawk's assault ramp while maintaining a steady fire pattern that kept the advancing Word Bearers at bay. As the ramp began to close, a corrupted attacker leapt the distance, its distorted form crashing into the captain and sending both tumbling into the gunship's troop compartment. The creature's form rippled as it attempted to bring clawed appendages to bear, but Lamiad held it at bay long enough for Guilliman himself to intervene, the hand of Dominion, reducing the abomination to a pulp of corrupted flesh and shattered ceramite. The Thunderhawks launched in tight formation, their engines straining against Calth's gravity as they accelerated toward the upper atmosphere. Word Bearers' anti-aircraft batteries, established in captured sections of the station, opened fire as the gunships passed, their tracer rounds cutting luminous paths through the void. Evasive maneuvers, executed with precision by veteran pilots, allowed the small formation to escape the worst of this fire, though one gunship suffered damage to its starboard engine assembly, forcing it to limp along at reduced speed. As the Thunderhawks cleared the immediate vicinity of the Civitas, Guilliman established communication with the Macrag's Honor. First Master Gage, his voice steady despite the chaos of battle evident in the background, confirmed that the flagship had maintained its defensive position and was prepared to receive the Primarch. The journey would not be simple, however, as Word Bearers' vessels had established a blockade between the station and the Ultramarine fleet concentration. The flight to the Macrag's Honor became a gauntlet of enemy fire and debris fields. The Word Bearers, alerted to the Primarch's escape, diverted significant resources to intercepting the Thunderhawk formation. Fighter craft swarmed from the hangars of trader vessels, while cruisers adjusted position to bring their broadside batteries to bear on the projected flight path. The Thunderhawks, designed for atmospheric operations rather than void combat, were ill-equipped for such an engagement. Salvation came in the form of a counter-attack launched by Captain Ethan from the remaining defense platforms. Recognizing the strategic importance of the Primarch's survival, Ethan directed all available firepower against the Word Bearers' blockade, creating a temporary corridor through which the Thunderhawks could pass. This action came at tremendous cost, as the platforms exposed themselves to concentrated enemy fire, sacrificing defensive positioning to ensure Guilliman's safe passage. The Thunderhawks reached the Macrag's Honor as Ethan's gambit reached its conclusion. The defense platforms, their weapons depleted and void shields failing, faced the full fury of the Word Bearers' fleet. One by one, they were overwhelmed, their destruction marked by expanding spheres of debris and escaping atmosphere. Captain Ethan, maintaining Vox discipline to the last, transmitted a final status report before his command platform was engulfed in a blinding explosion that temporarily overwhelmed even the flagship's visual filters. Aboard the Macrag's Honor, Guilliman was met by First Master Gage and the ship's senior officers. The command deck, a vast chamber dominated by tactical displays and communication stations, hummed with controlled activity as crew members coordinated the flagship's defensive operations while integrating status reports from surviving Ultramarine vessels. The Primarch moved directly to the primary tactical station, absorbing the strategic situation with a glance at the hololithic display showing fleet positions throughout the Calth system. The situation was dire but not yet hopeless. Approximately 40% of the Ultramarine fleet had been destroyed or crippled in the initial assault, with another 20% suffering significant damage. The remaining vessels had formed defensive clusters around key assets, including the Macrag's Honor itself and several orbital installations that remained under Ultramarine control. The Word Bearers' fleet, while smaller, had achieved tactical surprise and continued to press their advantage, targeting isolated Ultramarine vessels and critical infrastructure. Guilliman's arrival on the flagship marked a turning point in the battle for Calth's orbit. The Primarch immediately implemented a command restructuring that addressed the communication limitations imposed by the scrap code attack. Rather than attempting to coordinate all surviving forces centrally, an impossibility given the communication disruption, Guilliman established semi-autonomous battle groups, each assigned specific strategic objectives and authorized to operate independently within defined parameters. This decentralized command structure leveraged the Ultramarines' greatest strength, their ability to adapt standard doctrines to changing battlefield conditions while maintaining overall strategic coherence. Each battle group received clear objectives and boundaries, allowing their commanders to exercise initiative without requiring constant communication with the flagship. To facilitate coordination between these battle groups, Guilliman established a relay system using Thunderhawk gunships as mobile communication hubs, physically carrying updated orders and intelligence between fleet elements. The Primarch's strategic genius manifested in his immediate recognition of the Word Bearers' vulnerabilities. While the traders had achieved surprise and inflicted significant damage, their assault lacked the overwhelming force necessary to completely destroy the Ultramarine presence at Calth. By committing to a prolonged engagement, the Word Bearers had exposed themselves to counter-attack by a legion renowned for its ability to adapt and overcome tactical setbacks. Guilliman's first priority was securing the remaining orbital defense platforms, which provided both strategic firing positions and hardened communication relays that could be purged of scrap code. Battle Group Primus, centered around the battle barge Antradamicus, received orders to relieve the pressure on Platform Viridian 12, the largest remaining defense installation. Battle Group Secundus, led by the Macrag's Honor itself, would target the Word Bearers' vessels threatening the primary orbital shipyards, preventing further damage to this critical infrastructure. As these battle groups moved into position, Guilliman turned his attention to the surface of Calth, where Captain Ventanus and other ground forces faced an equally desperate situation. With orbital bombardment capabilities limited by the ongoing Void battle, the Primarch authorized the deployment of available reserves to reinforce key defensive positions around Garatan Spaceport and other strategic locations. These deployments, conducted via Thunderhawk insertions through gaps in the Word Bearers' orbital coverage, provided crucial support to the embattled surface forces. The Primarch's strategic reassessment extended to Calth itself. Recognizing that the planet's surface would soon become uninhabitable due to the solar anomalies reported by Captain Ethan, Guilliman issued evacuation orders for all non-essential personnel. Priority was given to civilian populations, with Ultramarine forces assigned to hold defensive positions long enough for evacuation transports to reach Calth's subsurface habitats, which offered greater protection against radiation. This decision, while tactically sound, came with tremendous emotional weight. Calth represented not just a strategic asset, but a thriving world within Ultramar, home to millions of citizens who had contributed to the Great Crusade through their industry and resources. The inevitable loss of the surface infrastructure and population centers would constitute one of the greatest tragedies in Ultramar's history, a wound that would never fully heal. As the counter-offensive gathered momentum, Guilliman received intelligence regarding the presence of Corpheron aboard the Word Bearers' flagship Infidus Imperator. The Black Cardinal, adoptive father of Lorgar, and one of the primary architects of the betrayal at Calth, represented both a strategic target and a source of intelligence regarding the broader context of the Word Bearers' treachery. Capturing or eliminating Corpheron could potentially disrupt the enemy command structure, while providing insights into whether this betrayal represented an isolated incident or part of a larger rebellion. The Primarch made the decision to personally lead a boarding action against the Infidus Imperator, a high-risk operation that would bring him face-to-face with one of the traitors responsible for the suffering inflicted on his legion and his realm. This decision, while tactically questionable given the Primarch's strategic importance, reflected Guilliman's understanding of the psychological impact his personal involvement would have on both his warriors and the enemy. The Ultramarines, seeing their Primarch taking direct action against the architects of the betrayal, would fight with renewed determination, while the Word Bearers would be forced to redirect resources to protect their leadership. The radiation storm that swept across Calth's surface drove the surviving Ultramarines and civilian population into the planet's extensive underground networks. These subterranean arcologies, originally designed as habitation centers protected from Calth's harsh surface conditions, now became the final line of defense against the Word Bearers' onslaught. Captain Remus Ventanis, having evacuated his remaining forces from the ruins of Garatan Spaceport, established his command post in the primary water processing facility of Lantier Arcology. Lantier's cavernous main chamber stretched nearly 2 kilometers across, its ceiling supported by massive ferrocrete columns inscribed with the emblems of Ultramar. Enormous purification tanks dominated the central space, their filtration systems processing millions of liters of water each hour to supply Calth's population. The facility's strategic importance extended beyond mere survival necessity. It represented one of the few remaining infrastructure systems not compromised by Word-Bearer sabotage or the effects of the solar radiation. Ventanis surveyed the makeshift defensive positions his warriors had established around the facility's main access points. The 4th Company had suffered heavy casualties during the retreat from Garatan, with barely 89 battle brothers remaining from an original strength of 200. These losses, while severe, had not broken the unit's cohesion. If anything, the shared experience of surviving the initial betrayal had forged the remaining warriors into an even more effective fighting force. The captain's vox bead crackled with static before clearing, a sign of the ongoing communication difficulties plaguing Ultramarine forces throughout Calth. The voice of Sergeant Anchise, commanding the northern perimeter, reported contact with another group of Ultramarines making their way through the transit tunnels connecting Lantier to the neighboring Sharad Arcology. The arrival of these reinforcements, 43 Astartes from the 39th Company led by Sergeant Ionid Thiel, represented a significant boost to Ventanis's defensive capabilities. Thiel's reputation within the Legion was complex. His unconventional tactical approaches had earned him both commendation for effectiveness and censure for deviation from Codex doctrine. Prior to the Word Bearers' attack, Thiel had been marked for disciplinary action, his armor's helmet adorned with red markings designating him for censure upon the completion of the Calth muster. Those same red markings now served a different purpose. In the confusion of the underground war, with Ultramarine forces scattered and conventional unit structures disrupted, the distinctive color identified Thiel as a leader around whom survivors could rally. The sergeant had used this accidental advantage effectively, gathering isolated warriors and civilian auxiliaries into a coherent fighting force during his journey through Calth's subsurface network. Ventanis integrated Thiel's forces into his defensive strategy, assigning them responsibility for the facility's eastern approaches, where intelligence suggested Word Bearers' forces were massing for an assault. The two officers quickly established an effective working relationship despite their different tactical philosophies. Ventanis appreciated Thiel's adaptability, while Thiel respected the captain's strategic vision and unwavering leadership. The water processing facility's layout presented both challenges and opportunities for defense. Its primary function required multiple access points for maintenance and distribution, creating numerous potential infiltration routes for enemy forces. Conversely, the massive purification tanks and filtration systems provided excellent cover and concealment for defenders, while the facility's reinforced construction offered protection against all but the heaviest weapons. Ventanis organized his limited forces to exploit these defensive advantages. Heavy weapon teams covered major approaches with overlapping fields of fire, while mobile strike teams prepared to respond to breaches in the perimeter. The captain established a central command post near the facility's main control room, maintaining communication with his scattered forces through a combination of Vox relays and runner teams when electronic systems failed. The facility's human workers, mostly technicians and engineers who maintained the water purification systems, had been organized into support teams under Ultramarine supervision. These civilians, though lacking combat training, provided crucial assistance in maintaining the facility's operations and constructing defensive barricades from available materials. Their knowledge of the facility's layout and systems proved invaluable, revealing maintenance tunnels and access shafts absent from standard schematics. 18 hours after establishing their defensive position, the Ultramarines detected the first signs of Word Bearers' infiltration. Auspex readings from the eastern perimeter indicated movement in the maintenance tunnels connecting the water facility to Lanchier's primary waste reclamation system. Thiel, anticipating such an approach, had already positioned ambush teams at key junctions throughout this network. The resulting engagement demonstrated the effectiveness of Thiel's unconventional tactics. Rather than establishing a static defensive line, the sergeant had deployed his forces in depth, creating a series of layered ambush positions designed to fragment and disrupt the advancing Word Bearers. Each position engaged the enemy briefly before withdrawing to the next prepared location, drawing the attackers deeper into a carefully constructed killing zone. The Word Bearers, led by elements of their 34th Company under Captain Sor Talgron, found their numerical advantage negated by the confined spaces and Thiel's unorthodox deployment patterns. Standard Legion assault formations, designed for open battlefields or ship-to-ship boarding actions, proved ineffective in the narrow maintenance tunnels. The traders adjusted their approach, breaking into smaller teams that advanced more cautiously, but this only slowed their progress while allowing Thiel's forces to engage each group separately. The culmination of this defense came at Junction 37 Alpha, a nexus point where 5 maintenance tunnels converged. Thiel had identified this location as an ideal ambush site and prepared accordingly. Demolition charges placed at key structural points were detonated as the main Word Bearers force entered the junction, collapsing sections of the surrounding tunnels and separating the attackers into isolated pockets. Ultramarine strike teams then eliminated these fragmented forces with precision and efficiency. This victory, while tactical rather than strategic, provided valuable intelligence regarding Word Bearers' operations in the subsurface network. Examination of the fallen traders revealed disturbing modifications to their equipment and physiology. Many carried weapons incorporating components that appeared biological rather than mechanical, while their armor bore inscriptions in languages that defied translation by standard Legion lexicon programs. Most concerning were the physical alterations evident in several warriors, subcutaneous growths that pulsed with unnatural vitality even after death, and ocular modifications that allowed vision spectrums beyond normal Astartes capabilities. Thiel's thorough documentation of these aberrations provided the first comprehensive analysis of how chaos corruption manifested in Astartes' physiology. His methodical approach, recording observations through picked captures and detailed notes, created a valuable reference that would later inform Ultramarine responses to similar threats. This information, combined with tactical assessments of Word Bearers' behavior patterns, allowed Thiel to develop specific counter-strategies that exploited the traders' newfound weaknesses, particularly their tendency toward ritualistic behavior that sometimes overrode tactical considerations. While Thiel's forces secured the eastern approaches, Ventanis faced a different challenge at the facility's main northern entrance. Word Bearers' elements had established positions in the transit hub, connecting the water facility to Lanchier's central habitation zones. This strategic location allowed them to intercept civilian evacuation attempts while preparing for a direct assault on the facility itself. The hub's open architecture and multiple levels made it difficult to approach unseen, limiting Ventanis's options for dislodging the enemy. The captain's solution demonstrated the adaptability that had made him one of Guilliman's most valued officers. Rather than attempting a frontal assault, Ventanis utilized the facility's water distribution system, as both transportation and weapon. Maintenance access ways large enough for Astartes in armor ran alongside the main distribution pipes, originally designed to allow repairs without disrupting water flow. Ventanis led a strike team through these passages, bypassing word bearers' positions and emerging behind their defensive line. The ensuing combat was brutal and close-quartered. Ventanis and his veterans engaged the word bearers at minimal distance, often in hand-to-hand combat that negated the traitors' heavier support weapons. The captain himself accounted for 17 confirmed kills, his power sword cleaving through corrupted ceramite with precision born from centuries of combat experience. When the word bearers attempted to withdraw to more defensible positions, they found their retreat routes cut off by a second Ultramarine team that had secured the hub's upper levels. This victory secured the northern approach to the water facility, but Ventanis recognized it as merely the prelude to a larger assault. Interrogation of captured human cultists serving the word bearers revealed that the traitors placed special emphasis on capturing the water processing systems intact. The reason became clear when Mechanicum adepts analyzed samples from distribution nodes that had fallen under enemy control. The word bearers were introducing contaminants into the water supply, substances that defied conventional chemical analysis but produced severe neurological and physiological effects in those who consumed them. The nature of these contaminants pointed to something beyond standard chemical or biological warfare. Microscopic examination revealed structures that appeared to shift and change when not directly observed, while spectroscopic analysis produced readings that violated fundamental principles of molecular composition. Mechanicum biologist adept Urkron Heron, who conducted the primary analysis, concluded that the contaminants represented a form of warp-influenced matter designed to create a conduit between real space and the immaterium within living organisms. This discovery elevated the defense of the water facility from tactical necessity to strategic imperative. If the word bearers gained control of Lanchier's primary water distribution system, they could potentially contaminate the water supply for multiple arcologies, affecting hundreds of thousands of civilians. The psychological and spiritual corruption this would cause aligned with intelligence regarding the word bearers' transformation from imperial compliance specialists to proponents of dark religion. Ventanis reinforced the facility's filtration control systems, assigning Thiel's forces to establish a defensive perimeter around the main purification chambers. These massive structures, containing both conventional filtration systems and archaeotech components dating back to Calth's initial colonization, represented the final barrier between the word bearers' corrupting influence and the civilian population. Their design incorporated redundant systems and isolation protocols originally intended to prevent accidental contamination, features that now serve to compartmentalize the facility against deliberate sabotage. The word bearers' next assault demonstrated their understanding of the facility's strategic value. Rather than continuing piecemeal attacks through access tunnels, they launched a coordinated offensive against multiple entry points simultaneously. This attack incorporated not just conventional Astartes forces, but also specialized units including several Galvorbak, whose partially demonic nature allowed them to bypass certain security systems through means that defied physical explanation. The battle for the purification chambers became the focal point of this engagement. Word bearers' forces under Sor Talgron's direct command breached the outer defensive perimeter through a maintenance shaft that had been inadequately secured. They established a foothold in the secondary filtration area, using its elevated position to direct fire against ultramarine positions around the primary chambers. Thiel, recognizing the threat this position posed, organized an immediate counter-attack rather than allowing the traitors to consolidate their gains. The sergeant's approach exemplified his unconventional tactical philosophy. Rather than committing his forces to a direct assault against a fortified position, Thiel utilized the facility's environmental systems as weapons. He ordered the emergency purge of several chemical storage tanks, flooding the secondary filtration area with a caustic mixture normally used for cleaning the most resilient contaminants from the system. This deluge forced the Word Bearers to abandon their elevated positions, driving them into pre-sighted killing zones where Ultramarine heavy weapons teams waited. While effective against conventional Astartes, this tactic proved less successful against the Gal Vorbak. These corrupted warriors, their bodies partially merged with warp entities, demonstrated remarkable resilience to environmental hazards. They advanced through the chemical deluge, their forms shifting in disturbing ways to adapt to the caustic environment. Where the chemicals contacted their armor and flesh, strange reactions occurred, the liquids sometimes boiling away, other times being absorbed into the warrior's mutating physiology. Thiel, observing these phenomena directly, adjusted his tactics accordingly. Recognizing that conventional environmental hazards proved ineffective, he focused on the Gal Vorbak's demonstrated vulnerabilities, particularly their tendency to undergo more complete transformation when heavily engaged in combat, a process that temporarily disrupted their coordination and tactical awareness. The sergeant organized his forces into small, highly mobile teams that engaged the Gal Vorbak briefly before withdrawing, preventing the corrupted warriors from completing their transformations while keeping them under constant pressure. This approach gradually wore down the Gal Vorbak's effectiveness, though at significant cost. Several Ultramarine warriors fell to the corrupted Word Bearers, their deaths marked by unusual phenomena, bodies aging rapidly after death, armor components melting without apparent heat source, or blood crystallizing into impossible geometries. Thiel documented these effects meticulously even amid combat, recognizing the importance of understanding this new enemy. The destruction of Calth's atmospheric shields began as a coordinated sequence of precision strikes rather than random acts of sabotage. Throughout the orbital infrastructure, Word Bearers strike teams had methodically placed melta charges at key junction points where the massive shield generators connected to their power sources. These devices, synchronized to detonate simultaneously, represented the culmination of months of infiltration and reconnaissance by specialized units within the 17th Legion. When the charges detonated, the effect was catastrophic. The primary shield generators, massive structures housing archaeotech components dating back to Calth's initial colonization, exploded in cascading failures that rippled through the orbital defense network. Secondary explosions followed as power relays overloaded, sending surges through systems never designed to handle such disruptions. The shield collapse wasn't merely a tactical development, it represented a fundamental shift in the battle for Calth. The orbital stabilizers, critical technology that maintained Calth's atmospheric integrity and regulated its exposure to Viridian's radiation, suffered similar systematic destruction. Word Bearers boarding parties targeted the control mechanisms with a level of precision that indicated extensive pre-planning and intimate knowledge of the system's vulnerabilities. The stabilizers didn't simply fail, they were corrupted, their machine spirits violated by arcane technologies that turned their regulatory functions into weapons against the planet they were designed to protect. Mechanicum Adept Terran Voss, monitoring atmospheric conditions from a hardened bunker beneath Lancier Arcology, watched in horror as his instrumentation registered the shield collapse. The readings defied conventional understanding, not merely indicating system failure, but suggesting impossible alterations to the fundamental properties of the shields themselves. In the moments before complete failure, the shields hadn't simply weakened, they had transformed, becoming conduits that actually amplified and focused the solar radiation rather than blocking it. This phenomenon pointed to something far more sinister than conventional sabotage. The Word Bearers hadn't just destroyed Calth's protective systems, they had weaponized them as part of a larger ritual focused on the Viridian star itself. The solar radiation bathing Calth's surface wasn't the result of natural solar flares, but rather a directed weapon created through the corruption of the star's fundamental nature. Aboard the Infidus Imperator, Erebus stood at the center of a ritual chamber whose design violated every tenet of Imperial technology. The chamber's walls, formed from materials that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, were inscribed with symbols that hurt the mind to observe directly. At equidistant points around the chamber's perimeter stood 17 Word Bearers, each bearing a staff topped with a crystal containing the essence of a navigator, sacrificed specifically for this working. The ritual Erebus conducted represented the culmination of knowledge gleaned from forbidden texts recovered during the 17th Legion's secret expeditions beyond Imperial space. These techniques, ancient when humanity first reached for the stars, allowed for the manipulation of stellar matter through the application of warp energies. The Viridian star, chosen for specific properties that made it susceptible to such manipulation, was being systematically corrupted, its natural fusion processes perverted to generate radiation that carried warp contamination alongside conventional electromagnetic energy. The effects on Calth's surface were immediate and devastating. The radiation that pierced the failing shields carried properties beyond conventional measurement. Where it touched exposed flesh, it didn't simply burn, it transformed, creating mutations that spread with horrifying speed. Metallic surfaces exposed to direct solar light developed patterns that shifted and changed when not directly observed. Communication systems carried voices that belonged to no living speaker, while electronic displays showed images of places that existed nowhere in real space. Captain Ventanis, receiving reports from observation posts that had maintained surface monitoring despite the deteriorating conditions, recognized the existential threat this development posed. The radiation wasn't merely a tactical consideration, but a strategic weapon that would render Calth's surface uninhabitable within hours rather than the days or weeks that conventional solar flares might have allowed. The timeline for evacuation to the subsurface habitats suddenly compressed from days to hours, an impossible schedule given the millions of civilians still on the surface. The Ultramarines' response demonstrated the adaptability that defined their legion. Ventanis immediately redirected all available resources to evacuation operations, establishing priority categories that balanced immediate vulnerability against strategic value. Civilian medical facilities received highest priority, with patients and essential medical personnel evacuated via all available transportation. Manufacturing centers with irreplaceable technology followed, along with food production facilities whose outputs would be essential for sustaining the subsurface population. This triage approach, while necessary, forced agonizing decisions. Many civilian residential areas received minimal evacuation resources, their inhabitants instructed to seek shelter in designated hardened structures that might provide temporary protection against the increasing radiation. These structures, originally designed to withstand conventional solar flares, proved inadequate against the corrupted radiation now bathing the surface. Reports from these shelters described conditions deteriorating hourly as the structures shielding failed against radiation that seemed to actively seek out vulnerabilities. The subsurface arcologies, never designed to house Calth's entire population, faced immediate overcrowding as evacuees flooded in from surface habitations. Environmental systems strained under the increased load, while food and water supplies projected to last years under normal conditions now faced depletion within months. The social infrastructure similarly strained, with civilian governance structures struggling to maintain order as traumatized refugees brought stories of horror from the surface. Lantier Arcology, one of the largest subsurface habitats, became a focal point for the evacuation effort. Its massive central cavern, originally designed as a public gathering space featuring artificial lighting that mimicked natural sunlight, was repurposed as emergency housing. Temporary shelters filled the space in orderly rows, reflecting the Ultramarines' organizational efficiency even amid crisis. Medical stations established at regular intervals provided treatment for radiation exposure and conventional injuries, while water and nutrition distribution followed protocols developed for disaster scenarios. The transformation of Calth's surface accelerated as Erebus's ritual reached its zenith. The Viridian star's color shifted perceptibly, taking on a purplish hue that astronomical instruments struggled to categorize within normal spectral classifications. Surface temperatures rose dramatically, turning exposed water to steam and causing rock slides as thermal expansion fractured cliff faces. Plant life withered and blackened, then underwent disturbing transformations as the corrupted radiation triggered mutations that produced organic structures with no evolutionary precedent. Sergeant Thiel, leading a reconnaissance team to a surface monitoring station after the initial radiation spike, documented these environmental changes with clinical precision. His observations noted phenomena that defied conventional understanding: shadows that moved independently of their casters, rock formations that rearranged themselves when not directly observed, and atmospheric effects that created visual distortions resembling faces or other recognizable patterns. These anomalies, while scientifically inexplicable, aligned with accounts from other conflict zones where Word Bearers' forces had employed warp-based weaponry. The long-term implications became increasingly clear as Mechanicum adepts analyzed projection models based on current radiation levels. Even if the Ultramarines somehow defeated the Word Bearers and regained control of orbital systems, Calth's surface had been irreparably altered. The corruption introduced into the planet's biosphere would continue to spread through surviving organisms, creating an ecosystem hostile to unmodified human life. The radiation itself, carrying properties that defied conventional shielding, would render the surface uninhabitable for centuries or possibly millennia. This realization forced a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. Calth could no longer be defended as a habitable world, but must instead be approached as a fortress, a hardened position from which to continue resistance while protecting the surviving population in subsurface habitats. Ventanis, conferring with other surviving officers via secure Vox channels, began developing long-term defensive plans that assumed permanent subsurface deployment rather than eventual return to the surface. The evacuation efforts faced additional complications as Word Bearers' forces targeted key transit hubs, connecting surface installations to subsurface habitats. These attacks, precisely timed to coincide with peak evacuation operations, created bottlenecks where thousands of civilians became trapped in vulnerable positions. The traitors demonstrated a disturbing preference for capturing rather than killing these civilians, taking prisoners who were then subjected to rituals whose purpose remained unclear, but whose effects manifested as physical and psychological corruption. Ultramarine response teams, stretched thin across multiple evacuation routes, fought desperate holding actions to keep these transit points open. Many of these engagements became last stands, with small units sacrificing themselves to delay Word Bearers' advances long enough for civilian transports to reach the relative safety of the subsurface habitats. These actions, while tactically necessary, further depleted the already diminished Ultramarine forces available for defending the arcologies themselves. The corrupted radiation's effects extended beyond immediate physical damage to include long-term environmental devastation. Soil samples analyzed by Mechanicum biology specialists showed fundamental molecular changes that rendered agricultural land not merely barren, but actively toxic. Water sources exposed to direct solar radiation developed properties that defied standard purification techniques, requiring specialized processing before becoming safe for human consumption. Even the atmosphere itself showed signs of contamination, with particulate matter carrying trace elements of materials that should not exist in real space. This environmental devastation represented not just a humanitarian disaster, but a strategic blow to Ultramar itself. Calth had served as a significant agricultural and industrial center, its outputs supporting multiple nearby systems within Guilliman's realm. The loss of these production capabilities would create resource shortages throughout the region, forcing redistribution of essential supplies from other worlds and potentially weakening Ultramar's overall resilience against further attacks. The Word Bearers, recognizing the strategic importance of Calth's environmental devastation, focused particular attention on agricultural centers and water processing facilities. Their attacks on these targets often involved specialized units carrying containers of corrupting agents designed to accelerate and direct the contamination process. Analysis of these agents revealed compounds incorporating both conventional toxic materials and substances that defied chemical classification, their molecular structures shifting when examined through different analytical techniques. Deep beneath Calth's surface, the arcologies that had once represented humanity's engineering triumph now became humanity's last refuge. These massive structures, carved into the planet's crust and reinforced with technologies dating back to the Dark Age of technology, offered protection against the corrupted radiation that now saturated the surface. Their environmental systems, designed for centuries of operation without surface support, recycled water and air with remarkable efficiency, while hydroponics facilities provided sustainable food sources. The transition to permanent subsurface habitation required fundamental restructuring of Calth's society. Surface-based industries became impossible, forcing the development of alternative manufacturing processes compatible with the limited space and resources available in the arcologies. Educational systems adapted to prepare future generations for lives spent entirely underground, while cultural institutions preserved knowledge of Calth's surface that would soon exist only in historical records and the memories of the oldest survivors. This adaptation process, while demonstrating remarkable human resilience, carried profound psychological costs. Surface-dwelling humans evolved with innate psychological needs for open spaces and natural light, needs that the arcologies, despite their impressive engineering, could never fully satisfy. Mental health specialists reported increasing cases of claustrophobia, depression, and anxiety disorders as the reality of permanent subsurface confinement settled into the collective consciousness. Religious practices shifted to incorporate this new reality, with imperial cult variations developing that reframed underground existence as spiritual protection against the corrupted heavens above. The Word Bearers' corruption of Viridian itself represented perhaps their most strategically significant achievement at Calth. By transforming the star into a weapon against the planet it had once nurtured, they created a persistent threat that would continue long after their forces departed. This approach aligned with emerging intelligence regarding the 17th Legion's transformation from compliant builders to architects of long-term corruption, their objectives shifting from simple military victory to fundamental alteration of the environments and populations they targeted. Mechanicum observations of Viridian's altered state suggested the stellar corruption would persist for centuries at minimum. The star's fusion processes had been perverted at a fundamental level, causing it to generate radiation spectra never observed in natural stellar evolution. These emissions, carrying both physical and metaphysical contamination, would continue to bathe Calth's surface long after the immediate conflict ended, creating a persistent reminder of the Word Bearers' vengeance against the 13th Legion and the realm of Ultramar. Deep within the bowels of the infidus Imperator, Erebus stood at the center of a chamber whose very architecture defied imperial design principles. Unlike the utilitarian spaces typical of Astartes vessels, this chamber had been constructed specifically for the ritual now reaching its crescendo. The walls curved in impossible angles, covered with inscriptions in languages predating humanity's ascension to the stars. At the chamber's heart rested an artifact of alien origin, the Cursus of Alganar, a device created by the ancient Kindbrak race long before mankind's first interstellar voyage. The Cursus resembled a complex mechanical astrolabe, its components crafted from materials that absorbed rather than reflected light. The device's inner workings shifted constantly, rearranging themselves according to principles that violated conventional physics. Erebus had recovered this artifact during a clandestine expedition to a dead world beyond imperial cartography, recognizing its potential as a conduit between real space and the Imperium. The first chaplain's preparations had begun months before the Calth muster, with Word Bearers infiltrators placing ritual markers at precise coordinates across the planet's surface. These markers, disguised as standard survey equipment or communications relays, formed a complex geometric pattern when viewed from orbit, a pattern designed to resonate with the Cursus of Alganar when activated. Each marker contained a fragment of warp-touched material, carefully shielded to avoid detection by conventional scanning equipment. Contrary to ultramarine intelligence assessments, the Word Bearers' primary objective at Calth was not merely military victory or even revenge. The destruction of the 13th Legion would certainly satisfy Lorgar's desire for retribution after the humiliation at Monarchia, but it represented only a secondary goal. The true purpose of the Calth operation, known only to Corferon, Erebus, and a handful of senior word bearers, was the creation of a permanent warp storm through the ritual use of the cursus. Corferon had initially advocated for deploying the Nexus arrangement, another Xenos artifact in the word bearer's possession, which could have simply destroyed Calth and the Ultramarines gathered there. Erebus had countered this approach, arguing that mere destruction lacked the symbolic significance required by their new masters. The corruption of Calth through ritual means would create a lasting monument to the ruinous powers and establish a permanent warp presence in the heart of Ultramar. The ritual required precise timing and positioning. The Word Bearer's fleet had maneuvered specifically to create a void battle that would unfold across predetermined regions of Calth's orbit, each engagement generating emotional resonance that fed into the ritual matrix. The civilian casualties at Garatin and other population centers were not merely collateral damage, but calculated sacrifices, their deaths occurring at locations where the barrier between real space and the warp was being systematically weakened. As Erebus manipulated the cursus, 17 word bearers stood at cardinal points around the chamber. These warriors had been selected for their psychic sensitivity and subjected to extensive preparation rituals that had left them more conduit than Astartes. Their armor had been inscribed with symbols matching those on the surface markers, creating a sympathetic connection that channeled energy between the ship and the planet below. The cursus responded to Erebus's manipulations, its components rotating and realigning as he recited incantations in a language that caused blood to seep from the ears of unprotected human crew members nearby. The device projected a hololithic display of Calth, with glowing points indicating the locations of the surface markers. As the ritual progressed, lines of energy formed between these points, creating a complex web that encompassed the entire planet. On Calth's surface, the effects manifested immediately. At each marker location, reality began to thin, allowing warp energy to bleed into the material realm. Ultramarine forces near these locations reported impossible phenomena, gravity fluctuations that caused objects to float or become crushingly heavy, temporal distortions that aged materials centuries in seconds, and spontaneous mutations in exposed organic matter. These effects expanded outward from each marker, creating zones of corrupted reality that grew larger as the ritual continued. The most significant manifestation occurred at the primary marker, located in the ruins of Garatin Spaceport. The device, disguised as a standard atmospheric monitoring station, activated with a pulse of energy that vaporized everything within a 100-meter radius. In its place formed a swirling vortex of energy that defied spectroscopic analysis, its colors shifting through spectrums visible and invisible to human perception. Survivors described the sensation of looking at the vortex as similar to vertigo, with accompanying nausea and disorientation that worsened the longer one observed it. The vortex began drawing surrounding matter into itself, first debris, then structures, and finally living beings. Those pulled into the phenomenon did not simply disappear, but underwent transformations visible to horrified observers. Inorganic materials twisted into impossible shapes before dissolving into their component particles, while organic matter experienced more disturbing changes. Human victims caught in the vortex's pull remained conscious long after their bodies should have ceased functioning, their forms stretching and contorting, while their screams continued through Vox channels, even after their vocal cords had been transformed beyond recognition. Ultramarine response teams attempting to approach the vortex encountered increasing resistance from reality itself. Within 500 meters, equipment began malfunctioning in ways that defied technical explanation. Auspex units displayed readings that changed when not directly observed, while Vox communications became distorted, sometimes playing back transmissions that had not yet been sent. At 300 meters, physical laws became unreliable. Objects dropped would fall sideways or hover, while energy weapons discharged with effects entirely different from their design parameters. Similar phenomena, though smaller in scale, manifested at secondary marker locations across Calth. These locations had not been chosen randomly, but positioned along geomagnetic ley lines that channeled the planet's natural energy flows. The Word Bearers had mapped these lines during the mustering period, disguising their survey activities as standard pre-campaign reconnaissance. By placing markers at intersection points within this network, they created a planet-wide circuit that amplified the ritual's effects exponentially. Captain Ventanis, receiving reports of these manifestations from across Calth, quickly recognized they represented something beyond conventional warfare. The pattern of anomalies, when plotted on tactical displays, revealed a geometric configuration that suggested purpose rather than random occurrence. The captain consulted with Mechanicum adepts who had experience with similar phenomena during compliance actions against cultures employing warp-based technologies. Their assessment confirmed his suspicion. The Word Bearers were conducting a planet-wide ritual of unprecedented scale. Understanding the threat required countering it, but conventional military responses proved ineffective against what was essentially a sorcerous attack. Bombardment of visible markers simply released the warp energy contained within them, accelerating the corruption process rather than halting it. Direct assaults on affected areas resulted in unacceptable casualties as Astartes encountered phenomena that bypassed their physical resilience and attacked directly at the level of reality itself. Sergeant Thiel, whose censure had partially resulted from his insistence on developing countermeasures against other Astartes legions, proved invaluable in formulating a response. His studies had included limited information on Word Bearers' ritual practices observed during joint compliance actions before their corruption. While incomplete, this knowledge suggested that ritual workings of this scale required symmetry and uninterrupted connection between component parts. Disrupting even one significant node might compromise the entire operation. Thiel identified the marker at Garatin as the primary node based on the scale of its manifestation and its position relative to other anomalies. If this assessment was correct, destroying or disrupting this marker would significantly weaken the ritual's effects across Calth. The challenge lay in approaching a phenomenon that actively corrupted reality within its influence radius. Conventional weapons would be unreliable at best and counterproductive at worst, potentially feeding additional energy into the ritual. The solution came from an unexpected source, Mechanicum Magos Mir Edv Torin, a specialist in archaeotech who had been on Calth to oversee the integration of recovered technology into ultramarine equipment. Torin had experience with null field technology, devices designed to create localized zones where warp influence was minimized. While originally developed to protect sensitive equipment during warp travel, these devices could potentially create a corridor of relatively stable reality through which an assault team might approach the primary marker. The null field generators in Torin's possession were limited in both power and duration, capable of protecting perhaps a dozen Astartes for approximately 30 minutes before burning out. This constraint meant the operation would be a one-way insertion with no guarantee of extraction. The team would need to reach the marker, disable it, and then attempt to withdraw through what would likely be collapsing zones of corrupted reality. Ventanis called for volunteers, making clear the suicidal nature of the mission. The response was immediate and unanimous. Every Astartes within hearing range stepped forward. The captain selected 11 warriors based on specific skills and experience, with Sergeant Thiel appointed as mission leader due to his unique understanding of the threat. The team included specialists in demolitions, archaeotech, and close quarters combat, creating a balanced unit capable of adapting to the unpredictable conditions they would face. The approach to Garatin utilized Calth's subsurface transit network, allowing the team to reach the outskirts of the spaceport without exposing themselves to the increasingly lethal surface conditions. The final approach would require crossing approximately 1 kilometer of corrupted terrain to reach the vortex's center, where the marker presumably remained active. Magos Torin accompanied the team to operate the null field generators, her mechanical components offering some additional protection against warp influence compared to fully organic beings. The moment the team emerged from the transit system into the ruins of Garatin, they encountered a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Structures had melted and reformed into configurations that violated architectural principles, while the ground itself rippled with patterns that seemed to repeat fractally at different scales. The sky above had taken on a bruised purple coloration, with swirling patterns that resembled anatomical structures rather than cloud formations. The air itself felt thick and resistant, as though reality were congealing around them. Tauren activated the null field generators, creating a bubble of relative normality around the team. Within this field, colors returned to their proper spectrum, and physical laws operated according to predictable parameters. The boundary between protected and corrupted space was visible as a shimmering distortion, like heat waves rising from sun-baked ferrocrete. As the team advanced, this boundary moved with them, pushing against the corrupted reality like a ship's prow through heavy seas. The resistance increased as they approached the vortex. The null field generators strained against growing warp pressure, their machine spirits howling electronic protests through Tauren's diagnostic systems. Physical movement became increasingly difficult, as though the team were walking through liquid rather than air. Outside the field's protection, they observed entities that defied categorization, not quite creatures, not quite energy patterns, but something that incorporated aspects of both while belonging to neither classification. These entities seemed aware of the team's presence, gathering along the null field's boundary in increasing numbers. They made no direct assault on the field itself, but followed the team's progress with a predatory patience that suggested intelligence. Thiel theorized they were manifestations of warp consciousness, drawn to the ritual energy, but unable to fully materialize in real space without direct invocation. The null field prevented such manifestation within its radius, but should the generators fail, the team would face immediate attack from entities against which physical weapons might prove useless. At approximately 500 meters from the vortex's center, the team encountered the first Word Bearer's defensive position. Unlike the entities outside the field, these were conventional Astartes, whose armor had been modified with symbols similar to those observed on the ritual markers. They had established a perimeter around the vortex, apparently tasked with preventing interference with the ritual. Their presence confirmed the marker's importance to the Word Bearer's objectives. The ensuing firefight demonstrated how the corrupted environment affected even conventional combat. Bolter rounds fired by the Word Bearers sometimes followed impossible trajectories, while others transformed mid-flight into crystalline structures that shattered on impact rather than detonating. The Ultramarines' return fire proved more reliable within the null field's protection, but the generator's power reserves depleted more rapidly during combat operations, reducing their operational window. Thiel adapted tactics accordingly, prioritizing speed over thorough clearance of enemy positions. The team pushed forward in a wedge formation, concentrating fire on Word Bearers directly blocking their approach while bypassing those on the perimeter's edges. This approach accepted the risk of enemies to their rear, but preserved precious time and generator power for the primary objective. Mago's Tauren remained at the formation's center, her mechadendrites constantly adjusting the null field generators to maintain optimal coverage as power levels declined. At 200 meters from the vortex, the team encountered a new obstacle, a ring of structures that had once been standard Imperial communication arrays, but now resembled organic growths more than technology. These structures pulsed with energy that interfered with the null field generators, creating fluctuations that allowed momentary bleed through of corrupted reality. Each fluctuation manifested differently: gravitational shifts, temporal distortions, or sensory hallucinations that tested the Astartes' mental conditioning. The team's demolition specialist, Brother Archo, identified structural weaknesses in these growths that might disrupt their interference pattern if exploited correctly. Using precisely placed melta-charges, the team created a narrow corridor through the ring, timing their advance to pass through during the brief window, before the surrounding structures could adapt to the damage and regenerate. This regenerative capability confirmed the quasi-organic nature of the corruption spreading through Garatan's infrastructure. As they approached within 100 meters of the vortex, visual observation became increasingly unreliable. The vortex itself seemed to shift position when viewed from different angles, while its apparent size fluctuated without correlation to the team's distance from it. Auspex readings provided contradictory data, sometimes indicating the vortex was kilometers away, other times suggesting the team was already within it despite sensory evidence to the contrary. Thiel relied increasingly on dead reckoning and inertial guidance, trusting the team's movement through physical space over potentially corrupted sensory input. The final approach revealed the true nature of the marker at the vortex's center. Rather than a simple device like those at secondary locations, this primary node contained a miniature version of the cursus of Alganar itself. The device, approximately 2 meters in diameter, hovered above a pedestal crafted from materials that had once been standard Imperial construction components, but had been transformed into something that resembled bone more than ferrocrete or ceramite. The cursus components rotated around multiple axes simultaneously, creating patterns that hurt the mind to observe directly. Surrounding the pedestal stood 7 word bearers in elaborate ritual garb, their armor modified with additions that appeared to be growing from rather than attached to the ceramite. These warriors made no move to attack the approaching Ultramarines, but continued their ritual movements, arms raised toward the cursus as they chanted in synchronized cadence. Their voices carried even through the vacuum that should have existed near the vortex's center, suggesting the sound propagated through means other than conventional atmospheric transmission. The null field generators reached critical depletion as the team arrived at the pedestal, their protective bubble shrinking to barely encompass the Ultramarines and their Mechanicum guide. Torin's analysis of the cursus confirmed its function as a warp conduit, drawing energy from the secondary markers across Calth and focusing it to create the reality breach manifesting as the vortex. The device's alien construction defied complete understanding, but its operational principles suggested that physical destruction might not be sufficient to end its effects. The energy patterns had achieved a self-sustaining resonance that would continue even if the device itself were damaged. Thiel, drawing on his unconventional tactical studies, proposed an alternative approach. Rather than attempting to destroy the cursus, they would disrupt its alignment with the secondary markers by altering the ritual parameters. This would require eliminating the attending word bearers without interrupting their chant pattern, then having team members assume their positions and introduce calculated discordance into the ritual. The precision required would be extreme, with a single misalignment potentially causing catastrophic feedback through the entire system. The team moved with synchronized precision, targeting the ritual attendants with silent close combat weapons rather than disruptive bolter fire. Each Ultramarine had been assigned a specific target, with the takedown timed to occur simultaneously to prevent the ritual pattern from adapting to the intrusion. As the word bearers fell, Ultramarine team members immediately assumed their positions, mimicking the physical stance and chant patterns, while Thiel coordinated subtle alterations designed to create constructive interference in the energy flow. The effect was immediate and violent. The cursus components accelerated their rotation, generating harmonic frequencies that caused pain even through Astartes pain suppression implants. The vortex above constricted, its swirling energies condensing toward a central point as though being drawn into a collapsing star. Magos Torin, monitoring the energy patterns through augmetic sensors, reported cascading failures propagating through the network of secondary markers across Calth's surface. The disruption spread outward from Garatin, following the same ley lines the word bearers had utilized to establish their ritual network. At each secondary marker, the controlled reality breach collapsed in upon itself, releasing a final surge of energy that destroyed the surrounding area, but prevented the continued corruption of reality that had been the ritual's purpose. The chain reaction moved faster than any physical signal could propagate, suggesting the connections between markers existed partially outside conventional spacetime. As the ritual collapsed, the team faced the challenge of extraction through rapidly destabilizing surroundings. The null field generators had failed completely, leaving them exposed to the chaotic energies released by the collapsing vortex. Physical laws reasserted themselves in unpredictable patterns, creating zones where gravity, time, and other fundamental forces operated according to contradictory parameters. The landscape itself began a transformation back toward normal reality, but this process generated violent energy discharges as corrupted matter reverted to its original state. The destabilization of Erebus's ritual created a momentary lull in the battle for Calth. As the warp energies receded from their peak, the Ultramarines seized this narrow window of opportunity to consolidate their scattered forces. Captain Remus Ventanus emerged as the linchpin of resistance on the planet's surface, his tactical acumen allowing him to coordinate defensive operations despite the catastrophic breakdown in conventional communication systems. Ventanus had established his command post in a hardened bunker beneath Lancier Arcology, surrounded by tactical displays showing the diminishing but still dangerous zones of warp corruption across Calth's surface. The captain's armor, once pristine ultramarine blue, now bore the scars of dozens of engagements against the Word Bearers. His left pauldron had been shattered during close quarters fighting in the water purification plant and replaced with a makeshift plate fashioned from salvaged materials. This improvised repair, functional rather than decorative, symbolized the pragmatic approach that had kept his forces effective despite overwhelming odds. The Fourth Company had suffered grievous losses, but maintained combat effectiveness through Ventanus's leadership. When standard command protocols failed during the initial assault, the captain implemented contingency measures that emphasized small unit autonomy within a framework of clear strategic objectives. Each squad leader received specific mission parameters, but retained tactical flexibility in achieving them, creating a resilient command structure that could withstand the loss of individual units without collapsing. This approach proved particularly effective against the Word Bearers, whose ritual-focused tactics often sacrificed conventional military efficiency for symbolic or arcane significance. Ventanus exploited this tendency by targeting support elements rather than ritual participants directly, disrupting the trader's operations while conserving his limited forces. His understanding of Word Bearers' psychology, their need for ceremonial precision, and their newfound devotion to elaborate protocols provided tactical advantages that partially offset the Ultramarines' numerical disadvantage. The defense of Numinous Gate exemplified Ventanus's strategic vision. This massive access point connected Lancier Arcology to adjacent subsurface transit networks, making it a critical choke point for both evacuation operations and defensive positioning. Word Bearers' forces had made 3 major attempts to breach the gate, each assault larger and more determined than the last. The third attack included specialized breaching units equipped with thermal charges capable of melting through the gate's adamantium reinforcement, along with several Galvorback, whose partially demonic nature allowed them to bypass certain security systems. Ventanus had anticipated this escalation, preparing layered defenses that extended well beyond the gate itself. The approach corridors contained pre-sighted killing zones covered by heavy weapons emplacements, while false defensive positions drew enemy fire away from actual strongpoints. Most importantly, the captain established a mobile reserve force that could respond to breakthroughs anywhere along the perimeter, preventing local successes from becoming strategic vulnerabilities. When the Word Bearers launched their third assault on Numinous Gate, they encountered resistance that adapted to their tactics in real time. As their breaching units advanced behind protective formations, hidden ultramarine teams triggered controlled collapses in the corridor ceilings, separating the specialists from their support elements. Simultaneously, the defensive fire pattern shifted to target exposed flank positions rather than the heavily protected frontal assault, forcing the Word Bearers to divert resources to shore up these suddenly vulnerable areas. The battle for Numinous Gate lasted 27 hours of continuous combat, with neither side willing to cede the critical position. Ventanus personally led 3 counterattacks against Word Bearers' formations that had established footholds in the outer defense perimeter, each operation precisely targeted to disrupt enemy command and control rather than simply inflicting casualties. The captain's understanding of Astartes' psychology, even corrupted Astartes, allowed him to identify and eliminate key leadership figures, whose loss would disproportionately impact enemy effectiveness. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Ventinus's defense was his integration of civilian infrastructure workers into military operations. These specialists, intimately familiar with Lancier systems, provided critical intelligence regarding maintenance passageways, structural vulnerabilities, and environmental controls that did not appear on standard schematics. Under ultramarine guidance, these civilians modified water distribution systems to flood specific corridors, altered atmospheric processors to reduce visibility in areas where word bearers held advantages, and reconfigured power distribution to strengthen defensive positions while creating hazards for advancing enemy forces. While Ventinus coordinated the overall defense of Lancier, Sergeant Eonid Thiel emerged as a specialist in direct action against word bearers' ritual sites. The red-marked helmet that had originally designated him for censure became a symbol of expertise in countering the 17th Legion's warp-based tactics. Thiel's unconventional approach to warfare, the very characteristic that had earned his Primarch's disapproval before the betrayal, now represented one of the Ultramarines' most valuable assets. Thiel's most significant contribution came through his methodical documentation and analysis of word bearers' ritual practices. Where other Astartes recoiled from the blasphemous symbols and corrupted technologies employed by the traitors, Thiel forced himself to observe and record their patterns, identifying operational signatures that allowed prediction of future actions. His data, compiled under combat conditions and often recorded in the moments between engagements, created a tactical framework for countering ritual-based warfare that would later form the foundation for Guilliman's codification of anti-chaos protocols. The sergeant's understanding of word bearers' methodology led to the development of specialized counter-ritual techniques. Thiel discovered that certain geometric arrangements of explosives could disrupt the symbolic patterns used in 17th Legion ceremonies, while specific frequencies of sound interfered with their chanted invocations. These techniques, while improvised from available resources rather than based on comprehensive warp theory, proved surprisingly effective in neutralizing localized ritual sites without requiring direct assault. Thiel's approach emphasized efficiency over heroics. Rather than committing large forces to frontal assaults against entrenched word bearers' positions, he developed insertion tactics using small teams of specialists who could neutralize ritual sites with minimal engagement. These operations typically involved no more than 5 Astartes, each selected for specific skills ranging from demolitions expertise to technical knowledge of environmental systems. The teams would infiltrate using maintenance passages or damaged infrastructure, place precisely calculated countermeasures at vulnerable nodes in the ritual configuration, then extract before the word bearers realized their ceremonies had been compromised. The effectiveness of these operations extended beyond their immediate tactical impact. Word bearers' ritualists, discovering their carefully prepared sites neutralized without apparent interference, became increasingly paranoid about unseen ultramarine presence. This psychological pressure forced them to divert resources to site security that might otherwise have been committed to offensive operations, creating a force multiplication effect that partially offset the Ultramarines' numerical disadvantage. Perhaps Thiel's most valuable contribution came from his willingness to adapt Ultramarine tactical doctrine to the unprecedented reality of fighting brother Astartes. Before Calth, such considerations had been theoretical at best and treasonous at worst. The sergeant's pre-betrayal studies of potential vulnerabilities in Astartes' combat methods, the very research that had earned him censure, now provided critical insights for warriors facing opponents with identical physiological capabilities and similar tactical training. Thiel identified specific weaknesses in standard Astartes combat formations when applied against equally transhuman opponents. Formations designed to maximize effectiveness against conventional enemies often created predictable patterns that other Astartes could exploit. By modifying these approaches, altering timing sequences, adjusting firing patterns, and introducing deliberate asymmetry into unit positioning, Thiel's tactics reduced the word bearer's ability to anticipate ultramarine responses based on shared tactical foundations. the sergeant's innovations extended to equipment modifications as well. Standard issue bolters, while devastating against most opponents, offered limited advantages when both sides utilized similar weapons and armor. Thiel developed field modifications that sacrificed ammunition capacity for increased penetration power, specifically calibrated against Astartes ceramite. Similarly, he adjusted power weapon emission patterns to create fluctuations that could overwhelm the energy dispersion capabilities of power armor when struck at specific angles. While Ventanus and Thiel exemplified tactical leadership on the ground, Captain Lysimachus Cestus demonstrated the same qualities in the Void battle above Calth. Commanding the battle barge Samothrace, Cestus faced the challenge of coordinating fleet actions against an enemy who had achieved both tactical surprise and strategic positioning advantages during the initial betrayal. The Void War had devolved into a series of disconnected engagements across Calth's orbital sphere, with ultramarine vessels forming defensive clusters around critical infrastructure, while Word Bearers' ships targeted isolated elements and vulnerable positions. Conventional fleet doctrine proved inadequate against opponents who combined standard Void warfare with warp-based attacks that defied tactical prediction. Cestus recognized that victory, or even survival, required fundamental reconsideration of naval combat principles when applied against corrupted Astartes vessels. The captain implemented what he termed dispersed concentration tactics, distributing his forces to protect multiple objectives while maintaining the ability to rapidly consolidate firepower against priority targets. Rather than forming traditional battle lines, ultramarine vessels operated in pairs or trios, maintaining separation distances that prevented enemy area weapons from affecting multiple ships simultaneously while allowing mutual support through coordinated fire patterns. Cestus's most significant innovation came in his application of atmospheric combat techniques to void engagements. Traditional void warfare emphasized broadside exchanges between capital ships moving on relatively predictable vectors. By adapting maneuvers more commonly used in atmospheric fighter operations, tight turns, rapid acceleration-deceleration sequences, and vertical positioning relative to the combat plane, the captain created engagement patterns that Word Bearers' gunners struggled to track effectively. The Samothrace itself demonstrated these principles during the defense of Orbital Platform Viridian 14, one of the few remaining functional defense installations in Calth's orbit. Word Bearers' vessels had established a blockade formation designed to isolate the platform while methodically reducing its defensive capabilities. Rather than engaging this formation directly, Cestus executed a series of high-velocity attack runs from constantly shifting vectors, never remaining on a predictable course long enough for enemy targeting systems to establish firing solutions. This approach sacrificed the raw firepower advantage of traditional broadside engagements for increased survivability and precision targeting capabilities. The Samothrace's weapon officers focused on specific vulnerabilities in enemy vessels, propulsion systems, weapons arrays, and command modules, rather than attempting to overcome void shields through sustained fire. Each attack run targeted a different critical system, gradually degrading enemy combat effectiveness rather than seeking immediate catastrophic destruction. The psychological impact of these tactics proved as significant as their physical effects. Word Bearers' commanders, trained in the same void warfare traditions as their ultramarine counterparts, struggled to adapt to an approach that violated established principles. Their responses often involved overcommitment to defensive formations that Cestus could then bypass or exploit, creating cascading tactical advantages that multiplied with each engagement cycle. Beyond these individual heroes, countless ultramarines demonstrated exceptional courage and resilience throughout the Battle of Calth. Squad leaders suddenly thrust into independent command, maintained unit cohesion despite communication failures and unprecedented challenges. Apothecaries worked tirelessly to treat wounded brothers while preserving geneseed from the fallen, ensuring the Legion's future even in its darkest hour. Tech Marines improvised repairs to damaged equipment using whatever materials remained available, keeping weapons operational long after conventional logistics would have deemed them irreparable. The psychological burden these warriors carried cannot be overstated. Unlike conventional combat against Xenos or human enemies, the Battle of Calth forced the Ultramarines to confront opponents who had once been brothers in arms. Many veterans had served alongside Word Bearers during compliance actions, shared victory celebrations, and exchanged combat honors. The betrayal represented not just tactical surprise, but existential shock, a fundamental violation of the brotherhood that defined Astartes' identity. This psychological trauma manifested differently across the Legion. Some warriors processed it through intensified adherence to doctrine and procedure, finding stability in familiar patterns amid unprecedented chaos. Others developed cold detachment, treating former brothers as tactical problems to be solved rather than individuals with shared history. A significant number channeled their emotional response into focused hatred, using controlled rage as psychological armor against the reality of betrayal. Ventanis addressed this challenge directly, creating opportunities for warriors to process their experiences through structured after-action reviews that acknowledged emotional responses while maintaining operational focus. These sessions, conducted during brief lulls in combat, allowed Astartes to articulate observations about Word Bearers' tactics and behavior changes without becoming overwhelmed by the implications of such transformations. By framing betrayal as a tactical variable rather than purely emotional trauma, the captain helped his warriors develop psychological resilience alongside combat effectiveness. The Ultramarines' adaptation to fighting corrupted Astartes extended beyond tactical adjustments to include recognition and countering of warp-based threats. Initial encounters with Galvorbak and other warp-touched entities resulted in disproportionate casualties, as warriors trained for material warfare faced opponents partially existing beyond physical reality. Standard target prioritization and damage assessment protocols proved inadequate against enemies whose physical forms did not correspond to their actual vulnerabilities. Through bitter experience, Ultramarine squad leaders developed new engagement protocols for warp-influenced opponents. These included recognition of manifestation patterns that preceded full materialization, identification of physical anchors that could be targeted to disrupt warp presence, and modified suppression techniques that incorporated symbolic elements alongside physical firepower. While far from comprehensive, these adaptations represented the first systematic Imperial military response to demonic entities since the formal establishment of the Imperial Truth. The collapse of Erebus's ritual did not mark the end of fighting on Calth, but rather its transformation into a new and more insidious form of warfare. As the surface became increasingly uninhabitable due to the corrupted radiation from Veridian, both Ultramarines and Word Bearers forces retreated into the planet's extensive underground networks. The vast subterranean arcologies, transit tunnels, and infrastructure systems that had once supported Calth civilization became the new battleground for a conflict that would continue long after the initial betrayal. Captain Ventanis recognized that conventional battlefield tactics would prove inadequate in this new environment. The underground war would be fought in confined spaces where line of sight rarely extended beyond 50 meters and ambient conditions ranged from total darkness to blinding industrial lighting. Sound traveled unpredictably through the complex network of tunnels and chambers, making auditory detection unreliable. Environmental hazards, from flooding and toxic gas leaks to radiation hotspots where the surface corruption had penetrated downward, created constantly shifting danger zones that both sides needed to navigate. The Ultramarines adapted their organizational structure to meet these challenges, breaking down into small, semi-autonomous combat teams rarely exceeding squad strength. Each team received specific territorial responsibilities and operational parameters, but maintained significant tactical flexibility. This approach leveraged the 13th Legion's disciplined self-sufficiency, while acknowledging the impossibility of maintaining centralized command and control in an environment where communication systems functioned unpredictably at best. ammunition conservation became a critical concern as the conflict extended beyond initial projections. With Calth's manufacturing facilities destroyed and no possibility of external resupply, each bolt round represented an irreplaceable resource. Ultramarine teams developed engagement protocols that emphasized melee weapons, supplemented by precisely targeted shots rather than the sustained bolter fire typical of open battlefield operations. Power swords, combat knives, and even improvised weapons crafted from industrial materials became primary tools for warriors trained in the most sophisticated weapons of the Imperium. The Word Bearers approached the underground war with different priorities. While they faced similar logistical constraints, their objectives had shifted from military victory to spreading corruption throughout Calth's subsurface realm. The 17th Legion deployed specialized units tasked with establishing ritual sites at key junctions in the underground network, places where infrastructure systems intersected or where population concentrations created opportunities for mass conversion. These sites served as anchors for warp influence, creating zones where reality gradually degraded and psychic phenomena manifested with increasing frequency. Sergeant Thiel documented this strategic shift through careful observation of Word Bearers' deployment patterns. The traders no longer concentrated forces for conventional military objectives, but instead dispersed into small cells focused on specific corruption tasks. Some teams targeted water distribution systems, introducing contaminants that caused hallucinations and increased susceptibility to chaotic influence. Others established broadcast nodes that transmitted signals inaudible to conscious perception, but which affected neural patterns during sleep cycles, causing nightmares that weakened psychological resistance to corruption. The most dangerous Word Bearers units were those dedicated to direct civilian conversion. These teams, typically led by a dark apostle or similarly indoctrinated officer, would capture isolated habitat sections and subject the population to systematic religious reprogramming. The process combined physical torture, sleep deprivation, and exposure to warp-tainted materials designed to break down resistance to chaotic concepts. Those who survived this process emerged as fanatical cultists willing to die for their new masters, while those who resisted too strongly became sacrifices in rituals that strengthened the Word Bearers' connection to their dark patrons. Ultramarine response to these threats required prioritization of limited resources. Ventanis established a classification system for Word Bearers' activities, designating ritual sites as primary targets, while infiltration teams received secondary priority. This triage approach acknowledged the impossibility of countering all enemy operations with available forces, but focused efforts where they would produce maximum strategic effect. The captain's assessment proved accurate. Disrupting ritual sites created cascading failures in the Word Bearers' corruption network, while eliminating infiltration teams merely delayed rather than prevented their objectives. The physical environment itself became a weapon in this subterranean conflict. Both sides learned to manipulate environmental systems to create tactical advantages. Ultramarines technicians reconfigured ventilation networks to direct toxic gases toward known enemy positions, while Word Bearers saboteurs introduced contaminants into water systems, supplying ultramarine-controlled territories. Control rooms for power distribution, atmospheric processing, and waste management became strategic objectives as important as any military strongpoint, their capture allowing manipulation of living conditions across entire habitat sections. Civilian infrastructure workers proved invaluable in this aspect of the conflict. Their intimate knowledge of Calth's subsurface systems provided insights no tactical database could match. Under Ultramarine direction, these specialists created environmental, safe zones, where atmospheric composition, temperature, and radiation levels remained within human tolerance. They also established early warning networks that detected environmental manipulation attempts, allowing defensive measures before conditions became lethal. The chronological progression of the underground war defied conventional measurement, with Calth's surface uninhabitable and its orbital infrastructure destroyed, standard time-keeping systems failed. The radiation from Viridian's corrupted emissions interfered with chronometric devices, causing them to run at inconsistent rates or display impossible readings. To maintain operational synchronization, Ultramarine forces implemented the Mark of Calth, a standardized radiation chronometer that measured time not in hours or days, but in the steady accumulation of radiation exposure. These devices, worn by every Ultramarine warrior and attached to key infrastructure points, provided a common temporal reference point despite the distorted reality of post-ritual Calth. The mark became more than a practical tool. It evolved into a symbol of the Legion's endurance against impossible odds. Warriors would check their chronometers before and after operations, the increasing radiation count serving as both tactical information and psychological reminder of their purpose. "The mark is still counting" became a common phrase among Ultramarines, signifying that while Calth itself might be dying, their obligation to defend it and avenge its desecration remained undiminished. The psychological impact of prolonged underground warfare manifested differently across both forces. Ultramarines, trained for disciplined campaign operations with clear objectives and end states, struggled with the ambiguous, seemingly endless nature of the conflict. Traditional metrics of military success, territory controlled, enemy assets destroyed, objectives secured, provided little satisfaction in an environment where boundaries shifted constantly and destroyed enemy forces were replaced through civilian conversion rather than conventional reinforcement. Ventanis addressed this challenge by implementing rotation protocols that moved teams between different operational contexts. Warriors who had spent extended periods hunting Word Bearers infiltrators would be reassigned to civilian protection duties, providing psychological relief through visible, tangible results in preserved human lives. Similarly, teams assigned to particularly contaminated zones would rotate to cleaner environments, allowing physical and mental recovery before returning to more demanding assignments. The Word Bearers experienced different psychological effects. Their embrace of chaos had altered their neurological and psychological baselines, making them increasingly dependent on warp energy and ritual activities. Extended isolation from major ritual sites or prolonged exposure to areas where Ultramarine countermeasures had strengthened the barriers between real space, and the warp created withdrawal symptoms ranging from heightened aggression to hallucinations and paranoia. These effects sometimes drove Word Bearers units to abandon strategic objectives in favor of returning to corruption zones where their warp dependence could be satisfied. This vulnerability created opportunities that Thiel's teams exploited systematically. By identifying Word Bearers units showing signs of warp withdrawal, they could predict behavioral patterns that departed from sound tactical doctrine. Some traitor teams would take unnecessary risks to capture ritual materials, while others would become fixated on specific symbolic objectives with limited strategic value. Thiel developed ambush protocols specifically designed to exploit these predictable deviations, creating kill zones along likely approach routes to corruption sites or ritual materials caches. The physical transformation of Word Bearers forces accelerated as the underground war progressed. Warriors who had appeared largely normal during the initial betrayal, aside from heretical markings on their armor, began developing physical mutations that reflected their increasing warp corruption. Some developed enhanced sensory capabilities that allowed them to navigate in complete darkness or detect heartbeats through solid walls. Others manifested more grotesque changes, additional limbs emerging from torsos, skin fusing with armor components, or facial features rearranging into inhuman configurations. These transformations provided tactical advantages in the underground environment, but came with significant costs. The more extensively corrupted Word Bearers became increasingly unstable, their behavior departing from recognizable military patterns to become more ritualistic and symbolically fixated. Some would compulsively mark territory with specific sigils before proceeding with their mission, while others developed elaborate pre-combat ceremonies that delayed their response to tactical developments. The most severely affected became almost feral, their transhuman discipline subsumed by warp-driven impulses that rendered them effective as terror weapons, but unreliable as military assets. Ultramarine forces developed specialized hunting techniques for tracking and eliminating these corrupted enemies. Traditional Auspex equipment proved unreliable against opponents whose physiological signatures had departed from baseline Astartes patterns, but other detection methods emerged through practical experience. Some mutations produced distinctive environmental effects, temperature fluctuations, localized gravity distortions, or chemical signatures that specialized equipment could detect. Others created behavioral patterns that trained observers could identify through subtle environmental disturbances, movement patterns, acoustic signatures, or disturbance patterns in dust or standing water. The civilian population caught between these opposing forces faced extraordinary challenges. The initial evacuation had prioritized essential personnel and those closest to secure facilities, leaving many others to fend for themselves in habitat sections that quickly became battlegrounds. Some formed autonomous communities in abandoned infrastructure nodes, establishing makeshift governance systems and defensive arrangements using industrial tools as weapons. Others sought protection from ultramarine forces, trading their specialized knowledge or labor for security within controlled territories. Most tragically, significant numbers fell under Word Bearers' influence, either through direct indoctrination or exposure to corrupted environmental systems. The transformation of civilians into cultists created a third faction in the underground war, neither fully human nor Astartes, but dangerous in their fanatical devotion to their new masters. These cultists served multiple strategic functions for the Word Bearers, acting as early warning systems, labor forces for ritual construction, and expendable shock troops whose deaths could be incorporated into larger corruption ceremonies. Water became perhaps the most critical resource in this protracted conflict. Calth's subsurface habitats relied on extensive water reclamation and purification systems that circulated the same limited supply through multiple use cycles. Contamination of these systems represented an existential threat to surviving populations, while control of purification facilities provided leverage over territory far beyond their immediate vicinity. Both sides recognized this strategic reality, resulting in some of the most intense fighting occurring around major water processing centers. The Ultramarines established specialized water security teams comprising both Astartes and civilian technical specialists. These units developed sophisticated testing protocols to detect both conventional contaminants and warp-influenced substances that standard chemical analysis might miss. They also implemented redundant purification systems, incorporating both technological and symbolic components, the latter based on Thiel's growing understanding of how certain geometric arrangements and material combinations naturally resisted warp influence. As the underground war extended from months into years, both sides developed increasingly sophisticated technologies adapted to the unique environment. The Ultramarines, drawing on the expertise of Mechanicum assets, who had survived the initial betrayal, created specialized Auspex units capable of detecting structural weaknesses in tunnel systems or tracking movement patterns through microseismic analysis. They also developed communication systems using hardwired networks supplemented by acoustic transmission methods that could function in environments where conventional Vox systems failed due to interference or power limitations. The Word Bearers pursued different technological paths, incorporating warp-influenced components into otherwise standard equipment. Their augmetic devices often included biological components harvested from mutated creatures or sacrificial victims, creating hybrid systems that functioned through principles combining technology and sorcery. These innovations produced capabilities that defied conventional understanding, weapons that caused wounds which spread like infections, communication devices that transmitted directly to recipients' minds rather than through auditory channels, and detection systems that sensed psychic emanations rather than physical signatures. The strategic balance between the opposing forces remained remarkably stable, despite the asymmetric nature of their capabilities and objectives. The Ultramarines maintained superior tactical discipline and organizational coherence, allowing them to coordinate operations across disparate zones despite communication limitations. The Word Bearers compensated with warp-enhanced capabilities and willingness to accept casualties that would have been unthinkable for loyalist forces. Neither side could achieve decisive advantage, resulting in a war of attrition that transformed Calth's subsurface realm into a labyrinth of contested territories, no man's lands, and isolated strongholds. This stalemate might have continued indefinitely had external factors not intervened. As the Horus Heresy expanded across the galaxy, both legions faced demands that drew resources away from Calth. The Ultramarines received astropathic communications from threatened worlds across Ultramar, each requesting aid against Word Bearers or other traitor forces. The strategic imperative to defend the realm of Ultramar as a whole gradually outweighed the symbolic importance of maintaining maximum force presence on Calth, leading to the gradual redeployment of units to other conflict zones. The strategic ramifications of the Battle of Calth extended far beyond the scarred world itself. What began as a localized betrayal evolved into a pivotal moment in the Horus Heresy, reshaping Imperial military doctrine and forever altering the trajectory of the Ultramarines Legion. As the underground war settled into a grinding stalemate, Roboute Guilliman faced decisions that would echo through the millennia to follow. The Primarch's initial assessment of the Calth betrayal had been tactical, a devastating surprise attack requiring immediate counter-response. As reports filtered in from across Ultramar, however, Guilliman recognized the true strategic dimensions of what had occurred. The Word Bearers' assault on Calth had not been an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign targeting multiple worlds within his realm. Simultaneously, disturbing astropathic communications from beyond Ultramar suggested wider conflict erupting throughout the Imperium. Most alarming was the complete communications blackout with Terra. No messages from the Throne World had reached Ultramar since before the Calth betrayal, despite repeated attempts to establish contact through multiple astropathic channels. The silence from the heart of the Imperium, combined with fragmented reports of legions Astartes fighting each other across multiple sectors, forced Guilliman to consider a possibility that would have been unthinkable months earlier, that the Emperor himself might have fallen. This assessment, though based on incomplete information, drove Guilliman's most significant strategic decision in the aftermath of Calth. If Terra had indeed fallen, the ideals and structures of the Imperium required preservation elsewhere. The Ultramarines Primarch, ever the statesman and administrator, began laying the groundwork for what would become known as Imperium Secundus, a contingency government designed to maintain imperial civilization should the original Imperium collapse. The formation of Imperium Secundus represented both practical necessity and psychological response to the trauma of Calth. Guilliman, whose legion had suffered devastating losses through the Word Bearers' treachery, sought to ensure such betrayal could never again threaten human civilization. The new governmental framework incorporated extensive checks and balances against concentrated power, with authority distributed across multiple offices rather than centralized in a single ruler. Macragge, as the capital of this emergency government, underwent rapid transformation. Defensive infrastructure expanded exponentially, with orbital platforms and ground-based installations creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any approach by hostile forces prohibitively costly. Civilian administration systems were restructured to maintain essential services even under siege conditions, while manufacturing centers shifted production toward military equipment and survival necessities. The psychological impact of establishing Imperium Secundus extended beyond practical governance considerations. For Ultramarines who had witnessed the horror of Calth, the creation of this contingency government provided purpose beyond revenge, a constructive channel for their energies that aligned with their legion's traditional strengths in organization and administration. Where other loyalist forces might have focused exclusively on retribution, Guilliman directed his warriors toward building something that could withstand the darkness they had witnessed. This approach reflected the Primarch's understanding of how deeply Calth had affected his legion's collective psyche. The betrayal had not merely inflicted physical casualties, but had shattered fundamental assumptions about the Imperium itself. Warriors who had built their identity around bringing order to the galaxy now faced a universe where their brother legions could turn against them without warning. The psychological armor of certainty had been stripped away, leaving raw vulnerability that required new frameworks of meaning. Imperium Secundus provided that framework, a tangible manifestation of the principles the Ultramarines had always fought to uphold. By creating governmental structures designed to preserve imperial civilization, even if Terra had fallen, Guilliman offered his warriors something to protect rather than just enemies to destroy. This subtle reframing transformed the psychological narrative from one of victimhood to one of responsibility, replacing helpless rage with purposeful action. The practical administration of Imperium Secundus drew heavily on lessons learned at Calth. Communication systems incorporated redundant pathways and authentication protocols specifically designed to resist the kind of scrap code attack that had crippled Ultramarine command and control during the initial betrayal. Defense planning assumed the possibility of enemies with intimate knowledge of Imperial military doctrine, creating asymmetric response patterns that would confound opponents expecting standard tactical approaches. Most significantly, Guilliman implemented systematic review of all Ultramarine combat doctrine in light of the experiences at Calth. The Legion had entered that conflict with tactical frameworks optimized for compliance actions against human worlds or warfare against Xeno species. Nothing in their training had prepared them for combat against other Astartes, much less brothers corrupted by warp influences beyond conventional understanding. This gap had cost thousands of lives in the opening hours of the betrayal, as Ultramarines applied ineffective doctrines against an enemy that knew exactly how to counter them. The codification of lessons from Calth began with after-action reports from officers who had survived the initial betrayal. Captain Ventanus, Sergeant Thiel, and others who had adapted successfully to the unprecedented challenges provided detailed analyses of what worked, what failed, and how standard doctrines required modification when facing traitor Astartes. These reports, compiled and systematized under Guilliman's direction, formed the foundation for what would eventually become the Codex Astartes. Thiel's contributions proved particularly valuable in this process. His pre-Calth studies of theoretical counters to Astartes' combat techniques, once considered borderline heretical, now represented essential insights for a legion that would never again take brotherhood for granted. The sergeant's documentation of word bearers' ritual practices, corruption manifestations, and tactical adaptations provided the first systematic imperial analysis of how chaos influence affected Astartes' psychology and physiology. The Ultramarines' combat doctrine underwent fundamental transformation based on these insights. Where pre-heresy training had emphasized set-piece engagements with clearly defined parameters, post-Calth doctrine incorporated extensive contingency planning for unexpected variables. Units trained specifically for rapid adaptation to changing conditions, with command structures designed to maintain effectiveness even when communications failed or leadership casualties occurred. Most importantly, warriors learned to recognize and counter the specific tactical patterns of each traitor legion, with particular emphasis on the word bearer's ritual-focused approach. This doctrinal evolution extended beyond tactical considerations to encompass strategic resilience. The Ultramarines had entered the Calth conflict with centralized command and control systems vulnerable to decapitation strikes. They emerged with distributed authority structures that enabled continued operations even when primary leadership was isolated or eliminated. This approach, formalized in the Codex Astartes, would eventually reshape the entire structure of Astartes forces, replacing the monolithic legions with more resilient chapter organizations. The psychological transformation of the Ultramarines following Calth manifested most visibly in the oaths of moment taken by survivors. These formal pledges, sworn upon weapons or relics recovered from the battlefield, bound warriors to specific obligations arising from their experiences. Some swore to protect civilian populations with their lives, having witnessed the word bearers' atrocities against non-combatants. Others pledged to document and study the nature of chaos corruption, recognizing that understanding this threat represented the first step toward defeating it. Most common among these oaths was the pledge to never again allow overconfidence or complacency to enable betrayal. warriors who had entered Calth expecting a joint muster with trusted allies emerged with a hard-earned skepticism that would characterize Astartes' interactions for millennia to follow. Trust, once given freely between legions, now required earning through demonstrated loyalty and shared sacrifice. This cautious approach, while sometimes impeding cooperation between Imperial forces, prevented numerous potential betrayals during the later stages of the heresy. The material cost of Calth shaped ultramarine equipment doctrine for generations. The Legion had entered the conflict with standardized wargear optimized for compliance operations against conventional opponents. The prolonged underground war, with its unique environmental challenges and unconventional enemies, forced adaptation using limited resources under extreme constraints. Equipment modifications developed during this period, from specialized Auspex units capable of detecting warp-influenced entities to weapons optimized for confined space engagements against armored opponents, became standard issue for Ultramarines operating in similar environments. More significantly, the experience of fighting with dwindling resources instilled a culture of equipment conservation and adaptation that persisted long after material constraints eased. Ultramarines who survived Calth developed habits of maintaining and repairing wargear beyond normal service parameters, extracting maximum utility from every piece of equipment rather than relying on regular resupply. This approach, codified in post-heresy training protocols, created a force capable of operating effectively for extended periods without external support, a capability that proved invaluable during the fragmented conflicts of the Scouring. The Word Bearers' corruption of Calth's sun ensured the world would never return to its former state. Surface radiation levels remained lethal for unprotected humans, while subsurface environments required constant monitoring for warp contamination. Agricultural production, once a significant component of Calth's economy, became impossible outside specialized shielded facilities. Manufacturing capabilities, severely damaged during the initial conflict, never fully recovered despite reconstruction efforts in protected underground zones. This permanent alteration of Calth transformed its symbolic significance within Ultramar. What had been a prosperous world representing the benefits of Imperial compliance became instead a monument to betrayal and resilience. The continuing mark of Calth, the steadily increasing radiation count that had become the standard time measurement during the Underground War, served as constant reminder that some wounds never fully heal, that the cost of the heresy extended beyond the immediate conflict into the far future. For the wider Imperium, Calth represented a turning point in understanding the nature of the heresy itself. Before this betrayal, many loyalist forces had perceived the conflict as primarily political, a power struggle between the Emperor and his favored son. The Word Bearers' use of warp-based weapons and rituals at Calth revealed the true nature of the corruption driving the traitors, forcing Imperial commanders to recognize they faced not merely rebellious warriors, but enemies whose humanity had been compromised by forces beyond conventional understanding. This recognition fundamentally altered Imperial military doctrine regarding engagement with traitor forces. Pre-Calth protocols had emphasized capture and potential rehabilitation of rebels, reflecting the assumption that traitors remained essentially human despite their misguided allegiance. Post-Calth doctrine acknowledged the irreversible corruption affecting many traitor forces, establishing extermination rather than capture as the primary objective when engaging enemies showing signs of warp influence. The Battle of Calth's most enduring legacy emerged through its influence on the Codex Astartes. Guilliman's systematic analysis of what had occurred, from the initial betrayal through the prolonged Underground War, provided foundational principles for this document that would eventually reshape all loyalist Astartes forces. The Codex did not merely compile tactical doctrines, but established philosophical frameworks for understanding warfare in a universe where betrayal had become possible between those engineered for absolute loyalty. Central to these frameworks was the concept of theoretical and practical, the analytical approach that had allowed Ultramarine officers like Ventanus and Thiel to adapt effectively when standard doctrines failed. The The Codex formalized this methodology, teaching warriors to develop comprehensive theoretical models for any engagement while maintaining the mental flexibility to adjust when practical reality diverged from expectations. This balanced approach, neither rigidly doctrinaire nor completely improvisational, created forces capable of maintaining cohesion even when facing unprecedented challenges. The division of legions into chapters, perhaps the Codex's most significant structural innovation, directly addressed vulnerabilities revealed at Calth. The concentration of 250,000 Ultramarines had made them a tempting target, while their centralized command structure created single points of failure that the Word Bearers exploited effectively. The chapter system distributed these forces into independent units of 1,000 warriors, each capable of autonomous operation while maintaining doctrinal consistency through shared training methodologies. This reorganization represented Guilliman's most profound response to the trauma of Calth, a systematic restructuring designed to ensure no future betrayal could threaten the Astartes as an institution the way the Word Bearers had nearly destroyed the Ultramarines. By distributing authority, resources, and personnel across multiple independent chapters, the Primarch created a system where no single point of failure could compromise the whole. The resilience demonstrated by surviving Ultramarines during the Underground War became institutionalized in organizational structures designed to withstand both external attack and internal corruption. As the Horus Heresy progressed toward its inevitable confrontation at Terra, the lessons of Calth spread beyond the Ultramarines to influence other loyalist forces. Officers from multiple legions visited Macragge to study the compiled tactical analyses and witness firsthand how Guilliman's warriors had adapted to the new reality of fighting corrupted Astartes. These exchanges, though limited by the fragmented nature of interstellar communication during the Heresy, created the foundation for post-war standardization of anti-chaos protocols across all loyalist forces. When news finally reached Ultramar that the Emperor still lived and Terra had not fallen, Guilliman dismantled the governmental structures of Imperium Secundus and mobilized his forces to reinforce the throne world. The Ultramarines who departed Macragge bore little resemblance to the legion that had mustered at Calth years earlier. Though still wearing the blue armor of the 13th Legion, they carried within them transformative experiences that had forever altered their understanding of warfare, brotherhood, and the nature of the threats facing humanity. The survivors of Calth brought with them not just tactical innovations and equipment modifications, but a fundamentally altered worldview. They had witnessed the corruption of everything they once held sacred, Brother Astartes turned traitor, the fundamental laws of reality twisted by warp influence, and the betrayal of oaths that should have been unbreakable. From this crucible of disillusionment emerged a tempered pragmatism that would characterize the Ultramarines through the dark millennia to follow, neither naively trusting nor cynically despairing, but clear-eyed about both the fragility of civilization and the necessity of defending it regardless of cost. In the grim darkness of the far future, the legacy of Calth endures. The radiation-blasted world, its surface still uninhabitable after 10,000 years, stands as silent testament to betrayal's lasting consequences. The mark of Calth continues its inexorable count, measuring not just radiation levels, but the enduring impact of a conflict that forever changed those who survived it. And in the combat doctrines of the Adeptus Astartes, in their organizational structures and operational protocols, the hard-won lessons of that betrayal continue to protect the Imperium against the darkness that once nearly consumed it.